Pink Floyd's been together quite a while.
Pink Floyd.
Yeah, I could listen to them a lot. I heard them in Hyde Park. I happened to be in London when they did a free concert. All I knew was there was something there. And I figured if we couldn't go in that direction, and get complex like that, then best for us to do what we can really do best, which is blues. I don't think we'll ever, I don't know. I guess Pink Floyd's been together quite a while doing that kind of music, haven't they? They're not an overnight thing.
This is from one of the last interviews Jim Morrison ever did, from December of 1970, 7 months before he died.
When I heard them, I said to myself, well, I like that.
He talks about Pink Floyd, Charles Manson, his thoughts on who controls society, drugs and alcohol, the story behind the name The Lizard King, and much more. This interview was conducted by Bob Chilrush.
If I'm ever going to listen to anything these days, I like jazz. I actually don't know a thing about jazz. But for me, what it means is a kind of music that's based on improvising, in which you start out a set and you have an idea of the steps that it might go through, but it could turn it into something different. And to me, there's a show where they know exactly what they're going to do every step. And they come out and do a lot of songs. And then there's another type of music where you can feel the musicians reaching. And that's the kind that I appreciate. Mm-hmm. And it can be in any music. It doesn't have to be what we call jazz. To me, that's what jazz is.
Now, given what Jim Morrison just said about how he's not the biggest fan of shows which are super structured, it's therefore ironic that Pink Floyd is one of the bands Jim admired. That Pink Floyd show Jim Morrison saw took place on July 18th of 1970. At the time, Pink Floyd still did some improvisation during their live shows. However, starting around the mid-70s, Pink Floyd's shows became very structured and technical. Jim died on July 3rd, 1971. Pink Floyd wouldn't release their 4 biggest albums until after his death. Dark Side of the Moon in 1973, Wish You Were Here in 1975, Animals in 1977, and The Wall in 1979. Infamously, during Pink Floyd's tour in support of The Wall from 1980 to 81, the band actually lost money after every single concert because of the massive cost of their complicated live shows and set design. Adjusting for inflation, Pink Floyd lost about $1.6 million US by the end of that tour, and the band members had to pay off that money from their own pockets. Now, at this point, Jim discusses his early musical preferences and what he thinks is his greatest talent.
It kind of came along when the old rock and roll was the big thing. And then I discovered blues in college, but man, there's just so much music. It's like swimming in a sea of marshmallows. I think more than writing music, and as a singer or any of that, I think my greatest talent was I had an instinctive knack for self-image propagation. I was very good at manipulating publicity because having grown up on television and magazines and all that, I knew instinctively what people would attach onto. I like any kind of reaction I can get. Just anything, I guess, to get people to think. I mean, if you can get a whole club full of drunk, stoned people to actually wake up, you're doing something. Because that's not what they come here for. It's just to lose themselves.
In terms of television and media publicity, the Charles Manson trial in the early 70s was global news. Jim Morrison personally knew Charles Manson. As recently as December of 2021, Jim Morrison's bandmate Robbie Krieger said that Jim Morrison once picked up Charles Manson as a hitchhiker and that Manson would sometimes hang out at Doors practices. Robbie Krieger said this in an interview with the publication American Songwriter. Now, does that mean Jim or the Doors had anything to do with the Manson murders? Not at all. But according to Doors biographer Stephen Davis, Jim Morrison was actually questioned by law enforcement about the Manson murders. In any case, the following is Jim Morrison discussing the Manson trial. Jim is asking Bob about Ed Sanders, a friend of Bob's who was covering the Manson trial.
Has he been able to talk to Manson? What is his impression?
It has to do with dope coming in. That's what it gets down to. The whole thing was a drug burn, apparently.
Drug burn. That was one of the original theories when it first happened, and that kind of got lost. What probably will happen, I hear they may only get 20 years. But, I mean, you can, on a 20-year sentence, you can get out in 3 years, conceivably.
crazy murderers, crazy people.
If he thinks they actually did it, about the way that the prosecution says it happened.
That's another case where Sanders was just upset because Manson had absolutely no part in the trial. I mean, he's just extraneous in a way that again, it's culture on trial. Manson's a symbol of something, and whether he did it or not really didn't make too much difference.
It's not clear exactly why Bob said here that Manson had no part in the trial. Manson attended the trial regularly as the lead defendant, and he frequently interrupted proceedings with erratic behavior. As a matter of fact, Manson disrupted the courtroom so frequently that on multiple occasions the judge had him removed from the courtroom and placed in a nearby holding cell. In any case, at this point, someone in the background seems to say to Jim that they don't care about the Manson trial anymore. Jim responds by saying, well, that's exactly what happens when a trial is dragged out for so long. People lose interest. The Manson trial started on June 15th of 1970, about 6 months before this interview was conducted in December.
I guess that's what happens. They drag it out so long that after a while, no one could care. I suppose that's one of the functions of a trial. They muddy it up so much that you don't know what to think anymore. In the LA Times, for example, you get a different coverage of the Manson trial than you would get in another publication. You get a certain slant on stories.
The Manson trial effectively ended on March 29th of 1971. When Charles Manson and 4 of his family members were all sentenced to death. Those death sentences, however, were never carried out because, in 1972, the Supreme Court of California ruled that California's death penalty was unconstitutional. Thus, Manson and his 4 followers were automatically given life sentences instead.
I was thinking of writing down my experiences going through a trial.
What does it look like your chances are in Miami of getting off? It's now just 1 misdemeanor charge?
2 misdemeanors. Well, I have to be optimistic, so I think there's a good chance. We're going to contend on several grounds.
Jim Morrison himself was also at the center of a major court case that got nationwide attention in the U.S. He was put on trial for allegedly exposing his private on stage during a Doors concert in Miami in 1969. I'm going to go much more into detail about that a bit later. But what's interesting here is that Bob asked Jim Morrison if perhaps he felt like Charles Manson did during his trial.
Did you find yourself excluded from the entire proceedings? The way I think Manson feels that he's not even a part of the trial. There's a whole system going on.
Yeah, I felt like a spectator, but I wouldn't have wanted to defend myself because I would have blown it, I'm sure.
Did you ever get to testify at all?
Yeah, I didn't have to testify, but we decided it might be a good thing for the jury to see what I was like because all they could do is look at me for 6 weeks or whatever it was. So I testified in a couple of days. I don't think it meant anything one way or the other.
As mentioned, I'm going to look much more deeply at the trial a bit later. For now, switching gears, this is Jim discussing drugs and alcohol.
So I went through a period where I drank a lot. I had a lot of pressures hanging over me that I just couldn't cope with. And I think also drinking it's a way to cope with living in a crowded environment, and it's also a product of boredom more than anything. I think people drink because they're bored. I do enjoy drinking. It loosens people up, and it stimulates conversation sometimes. I don't know, it's like gambling. You go out for a night of drinking, and you don't know where you're going to end up the next day. It could work out good, and it could be disastrous. So it's kind of a throw of the dice.
It's the disastrous ones that people remember. A lot of what was popular, even as far as drugs and drinking, seems to have died down.
Well, I don't know. I think there seem to be a lot of people shooting smack and speed, and everybody smokes grass.
Yeah.
I guess you don't consider that a drug anymore.
Well, no.
But 3 years ago, there was that wave of hallucinogenics. And then I don't think anyone really has the strength to sustain those trips forever. And so then you go into alcohol. Instead of trying to think more, you try and kill thought with alcohol and heroin downers. They're painkillers. Alcohol for me, because it's traditional, and also I hate scoring,
Scoring means getting drugs illegally, often off the street, usually through some shady drug dealer.
I hate the kind of sleazy connotations of scoring to people. So I never do that. That's why I like alcohol. You can go down to any corner store or bar, and it's right across the table.
Jim was a big drinker, especially in his later days. He gained a lot of weight, much of it from booze. His iconic rock star look was gone, but that didn't really matter because, according to Jim, he was thinking of leaving music anyways.
I just don't have the desire to get up and sing much. Kind of lost my interest for it. I got an instinctive feeling for the film media. I think I'll do pretty good at it.
Your ambition's to be a film director.
Yeah, and that's what I'd like to do.
A little bit later, I'm going to share with you more of what Jim said about his filmmaking ambitions.
Why do you think people go to see a rock concert, especially if they're going to be too noisy to hear the music?
I think people enjoy being in crowds. It gives them a feeling of power and security in a strange way. They like to rub up against hundreds of other people that are like them.
In terms of people and mass control, in 1969, Jim self-published a book titled The Lords. One of the things Jim repeatedly reflects on in this book is the question of who controls society and how.
I like at the end where you kind of define the lords as the people that are controlling art, enslaving people by giving them enough art. Did I understand that right?
Not controlling art necessarily, but just what that book is a lot about is the feeling of powerlessness and helplessness people have in the face of reality, that they have no real control over events or their own lives. Something is controlling it. But in creating this idea of the Lords, it also, I think, came to reverse itself. Now to me, the Lords means something entirely different. I couldn't quite explain it. Almost the opposite of that. Somehow the Lords are a race of people who have found a way to control their environment and their own lives. They're somehow different from other people.
Is there a particular person that you could think of?
No, it's not about any particular person.
Here, Jim reflects again on why people enjoy being in groups, whether it's at concerts or elsewhere.
For example, in LA or New York, many big cities, people are getting very neurotic and paranoid. Things like rock concerts communicate this unease. You have to have an excuse to mob together. Otherwise, it'd just be, what would you call it? That would be a riot or something, wouldn't it?
Lots of people would term what goes on at a Doors concert a riot.
Well, I did that a few times just because I'd always heard about these riots at concerts. So I tried to stimulate a few little riots, And then after a few times, I realized it's such a joke because people didn't think it was a successful concert unless everybody jumped up and ran around a bit. I think it has something to do with swarming theory. The idea that in insect and animal species, when the food supply, the population starts outstripping the food supply, the animals swarm together. It's a way of communicating and working out a solution or making each other signaling their awareness that there is a danger.
In terms of animals, at this point, Jim talks about snakes and about himself being the Lizard King.
There's something deep in the human memory that responds strongly to snakes. Even if you've never seen one, you have like a dragon, St. George and the dragon. I think a snake just embodies probably everything we fear. But also, basically their skins are just beautiful. I guess that's why they become so fashionable. And I think they always have been, but recently, snakeskin clothes and boots.
The Lizard Thing and Lizard King and all that.
That's supposed to be ironic. Also, and on a much more basic level, I've just always loved reptiles. I grew up in the Southwest for part of my life, and I used to catch horned toads and lizards, and I still can't get too near a snake. I mean, it's hard for me to pick up a snake and play with it. Some people can do it quite easily. I had a book on snakes and reptiles, and the first sentence struck me very acutely. It goes, "Reptiles are the interesting descendants of magnificent ancestors." And another thing about them is, if any creature could survive another world war or some kind of total poisoning of the planet, I think somehow reptiles would find a way to make it.
Here, Jim Morrison reflects on the band's various albums, including their upcoming album, LA Woman. He doesn't refer to it by name, however, as LA Woman was still being made. He talks about how he wants the album to be more blues-oriented.
The first album is not really socially conscious at all. It's just very personal statements. And then each one got a little more socially aware, perhaps to the detriment of the music, I'm not sure. Actually, I never thought of any of the songs as being political in that sense. Some of the words couldn't help reflecting the things that I ran into, traveling around. That was mainly it. It wasn't any conscious program. But I think probably the things we'll record now get back to the blues, essentially. I hope. You never know. When you start an album, you have one idea, and it could end up entirely different. But that's what I'm going to push for. That's the music I enjoy doing the best. It's the most fun to sing. I like jazz also, but you don't need a singer, really, for jazz.
Here, Jim mentions how his bandmates, Robbie Krieger, John Densmore, and Ray Manzarek, should also make instrumental songs.
Those guys really, they ought to do some instrumentals. I've always pushed for that, but they've been reluctant to do it. 3 guys, with a drummer and just 2 instruments. These guys put out a lot of music, a lot of sound. The places I always enjoyed were like an old theater. Bigger than a club, but not a sports arena. I think that our particular brand of magic worked best in a theater situation. In outdoor concerts, what we do just gets totally dissipated. An audience should be an active participant in creating what's happening, and you can even do that with a film. For example, it's up to you to close your eyes anytime you like. Or get up and walk out for 5 minutes and come back, and that makes an entirely different movie, right? Than what a person would see if they just sat dutifully through it from beginning to end.
A couple of things that you said about film kind of interest me, like the appeal of film is in the fear of death. Something like the appeal of cinema lies in the fear of death.
I just meant that I think in art, but especially in films, people are trying to confirm their own existence. Somehow things seem more real if they can be photographed and, if you can create a semblance of life on a screen.
What do you think's the point of all the violence? I guess starting with Bonnie and Clyde, it's gotten really explicit violence. If you can put it up in a movie where there's no immediate danger, then somehow you've transcended violence. So they try and make it more and more realistic. Trying to keep ahead of reality. You've done about 5 films? 5 that have been shown, at least.
Yeah, 2 of them are... Well, one of them really is a real film. Highway's the only really film I did. The others, I was actively involved in them, but they weren't really totally my film. But, yeah, I'd like to get Highway shown.
What's it about? If it's the kind of movie you can say, what is it about?
There's no story, really, no real narrative, except there's a hitchhiker who, we don't see it, but then we later assume that he stole a car, drives into the city, checks into a motel, and goes out to a nightclub or somewhere, and it just kind of ends like that.
You play the hitchhiker in Highway. Is acting something you want to get into as...
No, it was just easier. I had always been fascinated with a story about a hitchhiker who becomes a mass murderer. And I set out to make that film, but it turned into a different film, a much more subtle fantasy. Someday I'd still like to make that hitchhiker film, though, because I think it's a good one. It's an uncommercial type film, and it's too long for a short to play with another feature, and it's not a feature itself. 50 minutes. So it's an awkward length. I don't know.
Do you find that people are more willing to accept your films or more willing to dismiss your films knowing your notoriety or background as singer?
I think I may get a chance to make a film because of that notoriety. I'll probably get one chance, and if it doesn't really make it, it'll be very hard to get another chance. But I think almost anybody can get one chance these days to make some kind of film.
Mm-hmm. If the film is what you really want to do you find it's getting in your way when it's Jim Morrison, rock singer, director?
Yeah,
you probably have that after your name.
They always want a soundtrack or something.
Now, switching over to something a bit more controversial. As mentioned earlier, Jim was accused of exposing himself on stage at a Doors concert in Miami in March of 1969. To this day, however, not one photo or video of Jim exposing himself has ever emerged.
They had thousands of photographs from many different people that were there, and there was no photograph of an exposure or anything near it.
There is no known evidence if Jim actually ever did it. Yet, from the photos of the concert that do exist, something else very random was caught on film. At one point during the concert, Jim was randomly holding a lamb on stage. There was a friend of Jim's at the concert who happened to have a lamb with him. That guy gave Jim the lamb at one point in the show. This wasn't something pre-planned, it just happened.
That's a real lamb. It was really interesting that there was a lot of noise and a lot of commotion. It was almost deafening in the auditorium, but the lamb was breathing normally, almost purring like a kitten. It was completely relaxed. I guess what they say about what happens to the slaughter is true, They don't feel a thing.
There's no exact record as to how long Jim held the lamb during the concert, maybe a minute or two. But regardless, this photo of Jim holding the lamb was actually used by the Doors on one of their official releases. The Doors compilation album, 13, was released on November 30th of 1970. The inside sleeve of the album is Jim Morrison holding the lamb. It's interesting the Doors used that photo on an official album, given the fact the political fallout from that concert was still ongoing at the time. On October 30th, 1970, just 1 month before 13 was released, Jim Morrison was sentenced to 6 months in jail. Although he remained free on appeal, the possibility of eventually having to spend 6 months in jail was weighing heavily on Jim. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons he went to France in March of 1971 was to get away from all the continued legal and media fallout of the trial. A bit later in this video, I'll be going over the history of Jim Morrison's time in Paris, including his last day alive, how he died, and the fallout from his death. But first, here's Jim discussing the Miami trial.
They brought on about 13 witnesses. Every witness was either a policeman who was working there that night, or someone who worked for the city and happened to be there, or a relative of a policeman. In fact, that was their biggest witness, was a 16-year-old girl who was the niece of a police officer. And all their testimony was very contradictory. Every one of them had a different version of what happened.
I heard that girl called someone a little bitch.
That's what I heard. But they had thousands of photographs from many different people that were there, and there was no photograph of an exposure or anything near it. And the other charges, I think they just put in there to make it look more serious,
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the judge limited the defense's witnesses. We had 300 witnesses who were there, and we were going to parade them all in, get their side of it. He limited the defense to the number of witnesses that the prosecution brought on, which is an entirely arbitrary maneuver. We had over 300 people that were willing to testify, and they were there. They didn't see anything of any of those alleged incidents. Actually happened was a journalist happened to be there or heard about this concert. The next day he went and wrote a sensational story about the concert, got inciting to riot, and the citizens became irate and began calling the police station asking why this had been allowed to go on and why wasn't I arrested. And I'd gotten up, gone on to Jamaica for a holiday that had been planned down there. And about 3 or 4 days after the whole thing, they swore out a warrant for me. So you can kind of see how the whole thing began.
Did they put any limits on you as far as where you could travel or anything like that?
Not really. They might have, but we just went ahead and did a few things. But actually, the only thing I did was to fly to the Isle of Wight for a day, and then I came right back. We never knew from one day to the next when court was in session. He changed it every day, so we never knew. So to have flown somewhere for a couple of days, I really needed the weekends to rest up. It was kind of an ordeal.
Do you think the whole thing was out to get you or out to get...
I think it was really a lifestyle that they were going after. I don't think it was me personally. I just kind of stepped into a hornet's nest. I think it fulfilled a need people had, for some figure who would represent a lot of things, so they created this thing. I wasted a lot of time and energy on that thing, about a year and a half, but I guess it was a valuable experience because I think before the trial I had a very unrealistic schoolboy attitude about the American judicial system. My eyes have been opened up. If I hadn't had unlimited funds to continue fighting my case, I'd be in jail right now. They never really proved anything except profanity, which we admitted all along, that there was profanity used in the performance. We were going to attempt to prove that did not violate contemporary community standards in the city of Miami. And to do that, we were going to take the jury to see a lot of movies, like Woodstock. Hair was playing in town at that time. They had nudity on stage every night, and they were allowing young people to go in of any age. And all the books that were available, even in school libraries, junior high school libraries. So the judge refused to allow any investigation along those lines and limited it to a criminal action.
In a minute, I'm going to go very deep into the whole Miami situation. But first, very quickly, here Jim reflects on what annoys him in general about the press, and that he himself would eventually like to possibly work for a magazine.
People believe old press clippings or something, and it's like seeing baby pictures or something. It's kind of embarrassing and funny at the same time. People think you're 2 years younger than you are. I guess that's why you have to keep doing interviews. But I also believe in the interview as a new art form. Some of the most interesting things I've read recently are like self-interviews by writers. I don't know. I'd like to be involved in a magazine someday. I don't despise journalism at all. In fact, I like it. It's the texture of a magazine, and it's even partly the physical texture of the paper and all that. Even if you didn't read English, you could get kind of a feel, a city or something by reading the press.
Yeah. Newspapers just keep going under. So many things are folding, probably because media has changed a lot.
I guess things are happening so fast, they're so confusing now that people are more interested in the evening news and talk shows. They're just interested in what other people are thinking and what's actually happening.
Now, I'm going to read to you a segment from Stephen Davis's book, Jim Morrison, Life, Death, Legend, where the entire history of the Miami incident is extensively covered. Everything from the concert itself to the trial to the fallout afterwards, including Jim moving to France where he would die a few months later. Quote, "It was late February 1969 and the Doors were going back on tour. The plan was for Jim Morrison and Pamela Corson to fly to Miami together. But on the last day of February, as they were packing their bags, Jim and Pam got into a horrendous fight. Jim Morrison was extremely upset. In the limo on the way to the airport, the fight escalated into near violence, and Jim told Pam that she had to go home. She wasn't coming along. Jim would go to Miami and on to Jamaica by himself. Jim Morrison was furious now, and some band, was going to pay dearly. A few weeks earlier, the students at the University of Miami had been polled to find out their favorite rock group, which would be invited to play at the school just prior to spring break. The students chose the Doors, and the band had been invited to play at the Convocation Hall in Miami Beach. But the band's management accepted instead a better offer of $25,000 from local Miami promoters, who had more experience putting on rock shows. The Doors' problems in Miami started days before the band left Los Angeles. The local promoters, who ran The Image, Miami's Electric Ballroom, had a bad reputation. Other California bands told Doors manager Bill Siddons that they had been ripped off by The Image, which oversold halls and underreported gross ticket sales. On Saturday, March 1st, 1969, the Doors and their gear flew to Miami without Jim, who missed the flight. Bill Siddons waited at LAX until Jim showed up and sent Pamela home. As Siddons recalls, "We found a flight that went through New Orleans where we had a couple of drinks at the airport bar. By the time we got to Miami, I noticed that Jim's facial muscles had slackened, the only way I could tell how drunk he was. So I knew he was real drunk on the way to the gig." The Miami promoters had met the earlier plane and loaded the Doors' brand new tour equipment into their truck. When Siddons arrived, hours later, with a stone-drunk Jim, the Doors' booking agent informed Siddons that the promoters had removed the seats from the so-called Dinner Key Auditorium. In reality, an old seaplane hangar reeking of filth and damp, and had oversold the hall by thousands of tickets. When Siddons, backed up by his black detectives, threatened that the Doors wouldn't play, the promoter and his brother, a karate black belt supervising a thuggish crew, countered that the Doors wouldn't see their expensive new equipment again unless they appeared as contracted that night. Siddons told an interviewer later that the brothers threatened him if the band didn't play. No one said a word as Jim staggered into the dressing room. Jim was heavily bearded and wore a full black ensemble with a silver cross around his neck and a black leather broad-brimmed hat banded with a silver skull and crossbones pulled down over his blazing eyes. He looked about as dread as it was possible for a rock star to look in 1969. Jim Morrison was home, back in Florida for the first time in years. He was about as drunk as one could be and still put on a rough semblance of a rock show. Jim checked out the audience before he went on. Uncounted thousands of kids, mostly teenagers, crammed against a flimsy stage at one end of an evil-smelling old barn. Jim was, unwisely, briefed on the contentious, extortionate vibes of the show, the dodgy promoters, the threats. The band's agent said that it was the worst venue he'd ever seen. Vince Trenner warned the band that the stage was poorly built and could collapse. By showtime, Jim was mad as hell and totally liquored up. He proceeded to destroy his career in his family's home state. The worst and one of the most important rock concerts in history started late. John Densmore noticed immediately that the stage was shaking. Promoter Ken Collier, flashing the V-fingered peace sign, introduced the band by asking the audience to keep it cool. A tape made by an audience member captured a series of off-key harmonica notes played by Jim as the band tuned up on stage. Thousands of Kodak Instamatics flashed like lightning bolts. Kids were shouting stuff at Jim, and he responded, "Yeah, okay, right on, looky here. I ain't talking about no revolution, and I ain't talking about no demonstration. I'm talking about having a good time," Jim shouted. He told the crowd they all should come to LA that summer and rub their toes in the sand. Then he pumped it up. "Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready?" Then the door started pounding out Backdoor Man. Robbie Krieger recalls the following. Jim started rapping Rock is Dead instead of singing. He was pissed off. People were expecting a freak show instead of rock and roll when they came to see the Doors, and he hated this. He was venting his anger on this audience. End quote. Jim began cursing and shouting obscenities. The band got through the first two verses and into Robbie's solo. Someone threw a plastic bottle of orange Dayglow paint, which burst on the stage, splattering Jim and Robbie. Jim was now making sexual remarks towards the audience. He then started soliciting people from the audience. "Hey, listen, I'm lonely. I need some love. Come on." As Jim invited the audience onto the stage to give him love, the band shifted into 5-1. Jim managed the first two verses of the song, and then Robbie played his spiky guitar solo. Jim, enraged, started cursing even more now towards the audience. Jim paused as John Densmore pounded on, and the audience noise rose to howls of protest and alarm. Jim Morrison went on. "Maybe you love getting pushed around. You love it, don't you?" Jim Morrison jumped back into singing 5-1. "Your ballroom days are over." And then he continued talking to the audience. "Hey, I'm not talking about no revolution, no demonstration. I'm talking about getting out in the streets. I'm talking about having some fun. I'm talking about dancing. I'm talking about loving your neighbor until it hurts." The audience at this point had turned into a churning tidal mass of flesh. The band started Touch Me, but Jim wasn't in the mood. He took off his leather coat and threw it into the crowd. He traded hats with a cop and then threw both of them into the crowd. The band kept trying to play Touch Me. "Hey, wait a minute. Hey, wait a minute. This is all messed up. You blew it too fast. Wait a minute. I'm not going to go on." The band kept playing, but Jim was adamant. "Now, wait a minute. I'm not going to take this. I'm copping out, man." Ray Manzarek stopped playing, then started again and stopped when Jim wouldn't sing. The band started up Love Me Two Times, which Jim performed in a dead monotone. He then began to make obscene sexual gestures on stage. The band then went into When the Music's Over, and Jim sang as if he were underwater, slurring his lyrics to incomprehensibility. Then Jim began ranting again. "Hey, listen, I used to think this whole thing was a big joke. I used to think it was something to laugh about. And then the last couple of nights, I met some people who were doing something. They're doing something, and I want to get on that trip. I want to change the world. Yeah, change it. Come on. The first thing we're going to do is take over the schools. Then we're going to..." Jim paused to halt a fight in front of the stage, and went into a new vocal riff, Away in India, as the band vamped on a blues progression. For the next 5 minutes, Jim spoke with the kids up front. He asked for a cigarette and dozens were thrown on stage. He told the crowd he was from Florida. "You know I was born right here in this state. You know that. Yeah, I was born right here in Melbourne, Florida in 1943. He went on in this vein, insisting he wasn't talking about no revolution, no demonstration. He grabbed at his crotch, teasing the crowd. Someone yelled, "Take it off." Hecklers began to curse as Jim chanted more anarchic exhortations and eventually concluded When the Music's Over. Then he screamed "Wake Up" and recited the Lizard stanza, which led into Light My Fire. During the solos, Jim's friend Louis Beach Marvin, the Topanga Supermarket Premium Air, handed Jim a live lamb. Marvin had planned to follow the Doors tour with the lamb, which he regarded as a symbol of the vegan pacifism he espoused. Jim held the lamb to his chest. 5,000 flashbulbs went off. Later, he remembered being surprised that the lamb was so placid and unafraid. He could even feel its heart beating. As the band finished Light My Fire, Jim began grabbing at his private parts and exhorting the crowd to come up on the stage. All right, I want to see some action out there." He yelled this 5 times. "I want to see you people come up on here and have some fun. Come on now, let's get on up here. No limits, no laws. Come on, let's do it." People jumped on the stage. Someone poured champagne over Jim's head. Off mic, Jim asked the kids if they wanted to see his private region, and began unbuckling his belt. Everyone could see he was wearing boxer shorts, which interested the band because Jim hardly ever wore underwear. Vince, Ray Manzarek yelled over to Vince Trenor, the tour manager, "Don't let him do it," and Trenor ran on stage and stuck his thumbs in the waistband of Jim's leather pants. That way he couldn't pull them down. Nevertheless, Jim continued to posture sexually on stage. Thousands of flashbulbs recorded the scene. Promoter Ken Collier ran on the stage and told Jim, "Someone's gonna get hurt." Jim brushed him off and yelled, "We're not leaving until everyone gets their rocks off." Jim grabbed his under region and seemed about to take off his pants when Collier's brother tried to take the microphone away. Jim pushed him off stage. One of the local karate guys then grabbed Jim and flipped him over his back into the crowd, who caught him. Landing on his feet, Jim led the audience in a wild pagan snake dance around the cavernous room. In Bill Siddon's words, the band manager, the audience looked like a giant whirlpool with Jim at the center. Then, the stage itself began to tilt and collapse. John and Robbie stopped playing and ran for the dressing room. When John jumped off the sinking stage, he landed on the light board, which crashed apart in a sparking fury. Ray Manzarek recalled the following in an interview 25 years later. "It was Dionysus calling forth the snakes. The stage was collapsing. I played the riot, screaming, crunching chords. Part of me was saying, we're in serious trouble here. But I knew that Jim never actually exposed himself. What happened in Miami was a mass hallucination." After the shirt had been ripped from his back, Jim extricated himself from the Bachanal, followed by local photographer Jeff Simon, who snapped a picture of a bleary, bare-chested Jim on the balcony a few moments later, surveying with dazed satisfaction the aftermath of the chaotic scene he had orchestrated. The Miami concert and the Doors as originally conceived were over. Not much was said after that disastrous and fateful Miami show in March of 1969. It was, after all, just another royally screwed-up Doors gig. The band even laughed off the show with the off-duty Miami cops who were providing security backstage. Jim had sobered up and spoke about wanting to change the band's direction. When the hall was emptied, discarded clothes, underwear, and shoes were swept into the middle of the floor in a huge pile, measuring 5 feet high. The Doors road crew rounded up their amps and prepared to truck them to the band's next gig in Jacksonville, Florida on March 9th. However, there was trouble in Miami now. Larry Mahoney was a young reporter from the Miami Herald who had been a student at FSU at the same time as Jim and may have known him there. 2 days after the Miami show, Mahoney began writing inflammatory articles about the Doors' appearance, one of which suggested that Jim Morrison had exposed himself at the Dinner Key Auditorium. In his write-up entitled, "Rock Group Fails to Stir a Riot" on March 3rd, Mahoney reported that Jim flouted the laws of obscenity, indecent exposure, and incitement to riot. In Mahoney's words, quote, "Many of the nearly 12,000 youths said they found the bearded singer's exhibition disgusting. Included in the audience were hundreds of unescorted junior and senior high school girls. Morrison appeared to expose himself. He also got violent, slugged several of the Image officials, and threw one of them off the stage before he himself was hurled into the crowd." End quote. The band's tour manager Vince Trenor saw this article before he left Miami and called manager Bill Siddons in alarm. They both knew that Jim hadn't unveiled his considerable manhood. Neither had taken their eyes off him during the performance. Larry Mahoney then began leading a press campaign against the Doors. He called Miami's acting police chief and asked reporter-type questions. He called the Dade County District Attorney. Did they know a rock star had exposed himself in Coconut Grove? The cops tried to defend themselves, saying they had been too busy dealing with 2,500 ticketless fans outside the hall to arrest the star of the show. The FBI dossier concerning Jim Morrison contains a report on the show. The name of the informant is blacked out. Drawing on Mahoney's reporting, the informant declared that Jim exposed himself. Quote, "Informant advised that he is conducting an investigation and warrants will be obtained for Morrison's arrest on misdemeanor charges. The matter will be discussed with the Florida State Attorney's Office to determine if Morrison can be charged with a felony." End quote. On March 5th, Mahoney reported that the Miami police had issued an arrest warrant for Jim, charging indecent exposure and disorderly conduct by profanity. An assistant state attorney was said to have taken a statement from one of his office boys that Jim had displayed his private and that the state of Florida was considering pressing charges. It was all rubbish. There were several professional photographers covering the concert that night and thousands of flash cameras. The only image that comes close to indecent exposure is one where Jim has one hand in his pants and another reaching for his crotch. But regardless, Jim Morrison was in big trouble, much bigger than anyone realized. Officials at both the FBI and in the White House still believe that Jim had made threats against the famously paranoid Nixon. The FBI's notorious COINTELPRO operation was currently neutralizing, sometimes violently, the government's critics and perceived enemies. They were already harassing John Lennon, who had made outrageous statements against Nixon's policies. The thuggish prosecution and subsequent police threats against Jim Morrison jibe with what details can be gleaned from his censored FBI file to indicate that the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, may have had a hand in the persecution of Jim Morrison. Meanwhile, the Doors' lucrative tour was suddenly canceled. The Concert Halls Management Association, CHMA, put out the word that the Doors were poison. Their insurance company canceled their policies. Big money dates in Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Providence, Toronto, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Boston, Buffalo, Dallas, Houston, and others were immediately spiked. Suddenly, almost mysteriously, the Doors dropped off the radio, as if they've been banned from airplay. The band's manager Bill Siddons reached the group who were vacationing in the Caribbean and told them that the tour was off, suggesting they return to LA instead. Jim was warned that he could be arrested if he landed in Florida, so he caught a flight to New York instead on March 8th. At this time in early March of 1969, everyone around the Doors was completely freaked out about the canceled tour and the enormous loss of revenue, all of which happened as a result of the controversy coming from the Miami show, except for Jim Morrison. He seemed relieved. The whole thing had been on his shoulders and now he was free. He came home to LA and met with his lawyers about what to do. He kept growing his beard, put on some weight, and dressed down. On and off girlfriend Pamela Corson supposedly told friends that Jim had admitted to her that he had flashed his meat in Miami. She asked him why he had done it, and Jim said, "Honey, I just wanted to see what it looked like in the spotlight." This is probably apocryphal, an exaggeration, but Elmer Valentine, who owned the whiskey, also claimed that Jim told him he thought he might have fished it out. With time on his hands, Jim immersed himself in other interests. He published the poem Dry Water in the Los Angeles Image, a counterculture magazine. Sometime in March, the tapes are undated, Jim gathered his notebooks and taped more than an hour's worth of poems, lyrics, and fragments in either Elektra Studio or at Sunset Sound. The engineer was John Haney, who had been Elektra's chief engineer since the beginning of the year. This recording session yielded 40 spoken-word Morrison poems, some of which, Bird of Prey, Under Waterfall, Orange Country, were sung by Jim a cappella as if musical accompaniment could be recorded later. Among the pieces were Indians Scattered on Dawn's Highway, sections of An American Prayer, 2 verses of Texas Radio, Stoned Immaculate, and Motel Money Murder Madness. There were also several fragments that were later united into a posthumous poem, Far Arden. Arden was the family name of William Shakespeare's mother, and the Forest of Arden is the setting for William Shakespeare's play As You Like It. Jim spoke, chanted, and sang in a bell-clear baritone, reading from his notebooks in carefully thought-out cadences, as if he had rehearsed material he had repeatedly polished and refined. Some have speculated that these tapes were meant to be released in some form if Jim went to jail for the Miami concert. Portions of these poems were eventually adapted and used by the Doors to carry on Jim's image long after he had died. Poets and critics who have heard these visionary taped experiments agree that Jim Morrison was creating a new American poetry that worked on a very high level, one that didn't necessarily transpose successfully to the printed page. Ray Manzarek claims the Doors confronted Jim about his drinking at a band meeting at Robbie's parents' house in the Pacific Palisades, where the Doors had worked on some of the soft parade songs. In his memoir, Ray said they had all told him he was drinking too much and that it looked like he was killing himself. According to Manzarek, Jim acknowledged his problem, saying simply and sadly, "I know I drink too much, Ray. I'm trying to quit." That was enough for the Doors. Jim knew it was what they wanted to hear, so he didn't quit. He just kept boozing with Babe Hill at the Palms. Max Fink, Jim Morrison's Beverly Hills attorney, was contacted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation late in March concerning criminal charges against Jim relating to the Doors' Miami concert. The FBI got a federal judge to issue a warrant for Jim, citing interstate flight to avoid prosecution. This was absurd, since Jim had left Florida before any charges had been filed, and Florida only declared him a fugitive of justice in a warrant signed by Governor Claude R. Kirk Jr. on April 18th. Fink was getting the distinct impression that somebody in the FBI wanted Jim Morrison put away in prison. The situation was extremely serious and potentially very dangerous for Jim. On or about Friday, April 4th, 1969, Jim Morrison and Max Fink arrived at the FBI's downtown Los Angeles office, where Jim was arrested. By prior arrangement, a U.S. magistrate immediately released James Douglas Morrison, an active service admiral's son and major heavy-duty American rock star, on $5,000 bail. On August 6, 1970, Jim Morrison and his entourage, lawyer Max Fink and bodyguards Babe Hill and Tony Fuentes, flew to Miami and checked into the Carlin Resort Hotel in Miami Beach. They were joined by Mike Gershman, a publicist whose Los Angeles firm also represented the Rolling Stones. The other Doors, who were expected to testify at Jim's trial, arrived a few days later. The proceedings were supposed to begin on Monday, August 10th, but were postponed for 2 days. The judge was Murray Goodman, and Jim wasn't helped by the fact that the judge hated Jim's local attorney, Robert Josephsberg, or that 62-year-old Max Fink referred to Miami as, quote, one of the most immoral cities in the United States during a press conference. The county's prosecutor was a relatively hip young assistant state attorney, Terrence McWilliams, who sucked up to Jim, asking for signed copies of his records while doing his best to send him to prison. The judge made it clear early on that he wasn't going to postpone the trial so that the Doors could play shows, so the band reluctantly canceled their European tour scheduled for early September in 1970. The whole scene in the Metro-Dade Justice Building had the stink of corruption to it. It was obvious to Miami's veteran legal observers that Jim Morrison was being railroaded to prison under the watchful eye of the Nixon administration. Somebody was out to break the Doors financially and physically, and it became apparent that no one in the media was going to stand up for Jim Morrison in his hour of need. The 6-person jury was sworn in on August 14, 1970. That night, Jim and his crew went to see John Fogerty's hard-rocking band Creedence Clearwater Revival play in Miami Beach. Then they went to the Hump, a hotel club, to see Canned Heat play. Bob Hitt called Jim up to the stage, where he did Backdoor Man and other blues tunes for almost an hour. They had to push past the crush of TV crews, radio reporters, and fans on Monday, August 17th. The nationally famous thief, Murph the Surf, was being tried on a robbery charge in the adjacent courtroom. Jim sat at the defense table, taking notes as the testimony began. After opening statements during which Max Fink claimed the charges against Jim were baseless and motivated by unsavory local politics, 2 witnesses, Betty Racine and Colleen Clary, testified that Jim Morrison had exposed himself for 10 seconds, according to the ponytail drugstore cashier, Miss Clary. Another prosecution witness, the one who had signed the original complaint, turned out to be an employee in the prosecutor's office. Max Fink picked their stories apart during cross-examination and asked the court to be allowed to present community standards evidence exposing the jury to the public nudity of the Woodstock movie and the Miami production of Hair. The following day, photographer Jeff Simon, who was 5 feet away from Jim during the entire concert in March of 1970, where this infamous situation took place, or rather didn't take place, testified that he didn't see Jim whip it out. More than 100 of Simon's photos were introduced as evidence. On August 20th, Judge Goodman ruled that community standards were irrelevant to this case. With the jury excused, Fink excoriated the judge's ruling, drawing applause from the spectators. But the ruling stood. The Doors played 2 California shows that weekend. Friday night in Bakersfield, the kids were packed in front of the stage like penned animals, and the Doors played for 3 hours. Jim bore down, concentrating furiously, performing Celebration with careful enunciation, requesting cigarettes from the audience, and consuming maybe a gallon of beer. The next night in San Diego, he introduced the show by yelling, "This whole thing started with rock and roll and now it's out of control." Again, the Doors played a great show, which no one would have known would be the last of its kind, the end of an era that had begun 5 years earlier in the hopeful sunshine of a summer's day on Venice Beach. Judge Goodman's Kangaroo Court reconvened on Tuesday, August 25th. A female police officer testified that the cops had been afraid to arrest Jim because they thought it would provoke a riot. Max Fink pointed out that the arrest could have been made after the show, but that nothing had happened. Fink insisted that a media-fueled hysteria had eventually forced police to file charges against an innocent artist. 2 days later, the prosecution played the jury the tape of the show, which sounded coarse, seditious, and chaotic, but offered no proof that Jim had displayed his regenerative organ. Judge Goodman then adjourned for the weekend so the Doors could perform at the Isle of Wight Festival off the south coast of England, one of the last great outdoor events of the decade. Jim Morrison was back in Miami for the resumption of the legal proceedings against him on September 2nd, 1970. The Isle of Wight show was to have been the start of a lucrative European tour that would have taken the band to Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and Paris. All the dates had been canceled because of Jim's trial commitments. The atmosphere in off-season Miami was subdued, even morose. The scene at the trial was totally weird. The prosecution rested on September 2nd. Max Fink had 60 rebuttal witnesses. The judge ruled that he could present only 17. The next day, the judge declared an 11-day recess, infuriating the band, which had canceled its tour. The trial was costing a fortune in both money and morale. Jim wanted to return to LA because Pamela Courson sounded so stoned on the telephone, slurring her words or laughing uncontrollably, but the lawyers talked him out of it. Patricia Kennelly also arrived in Miami, claiming that Jim had married her and that she was pregnant. Jim's bodyguard, Babe, had asked him about this. "I don't know what I did," Jim told him. "I was drunk. Maybe I did. but there was no emotional involvement with her. Detention at the Carolyn Hotel was diabolical, so Jim and his crew, Babe Hill, Frank Luciandro, and Max Fink, retreated to the Bahamas for a few days of fishing, snorkeling, and drinking rum. Back in Miami, they went to an Elvis Presley concert at the huge convention center, strobe lit by instamatic flashes, during which Elvis strutted and posed in a succession of iconic tableaux. Jim was impressed by Elvis's great band, which included guitarist James Burton, drummer Ronnie Tutt, and bassist Jerry Scheff. The local press was particularly craven about Jim's legal ordeal in their town. The Miami News reported the following. Attired in a tan suede jacket with sheepskin lining, Morrison looked like a ranch hand in search of a barber. An unidentified friend was far more flamboyantly attired in tapestry coat and rust-colored bell-bottoms, end quote. The paper sent young reporters to cover the trial, and they would approach Jim in the hallways almost on bended knee, according to Mike Gershman, as if Jim were taboo or not quite real. Their questions were shallow and useless, the TV coverage was dumb, and no one bothered to notice that a major political fix was in. Then again, a lot of people in Miami thought Jim Morrison was getting what he deserved, and maybe even what he wanted. A few months later, Jim told Rolling Stone's Ben Fong Torres, "You know, I thought there was a possibility of it becoming a major groundbreaking kind of case, but it didn't turn out that way. It actually received very little national attention. And in a way, I was kind of relieved because as the case moved on, there were no great ideals at stake." A high school student, Steve Rosenberg, attended the trial almost every day. When the crowds died out as the case dragged on, Jim noticed him in the hallways and answered Steve's respectful questions about what poetry he liked, Rimbaud, and what music he was listening to, Pink Floyd. During a recess, Jim asked if there was a Burger King around, and Steve drove him to the nearest one in his mother's '63 Chrysler Newport. Jim liked the car. "Cool air conditioning," he commented. "Really blows a lot of air." He had 2 Whoppers and a thick shake. He was fat, bearded, and a little spacey, Rosenberg recalled. "I had to draw him out. Then I just drove him back to the courthouse." Court reconvened on September 14th. The legal proceedings and witnesses were so boring that Jim stopped taking notes. Jim testified 2 days later, the other Doors the day after that. The judge was being a hard-nose, and the press ignored the trial. The Doors' own publicist filed stories for Rock magazine, which came out weeks later. Jim's mood sank to a new low on September 19th when word of Jimi Hendrix's death in London got out. Jim and Babe were both tripping on acid when they heard Hendrix had died. The official version was that Hendrix had swallowed a handful of Quaaludes and had choked to death when he vomited while in a coma. But it was well known in the music business that Hendrix was leaving his manager and so was worth more dead than alive to certain people. After the move to dismiss, denied, the closing arguments, and Judge Goodman's highly unorthodox directive to find the defendant guilty, the jury returned with its verdicts on September 20th, 1970. Jim Morrison was found guilty on misdemeanor counts of indecent exposure and open profanity. He was acquitted of public drunkenness and of the felony charge of lewd and lascivious behavior. None of this made any sense. The whole trial had been a farce. Goodman had already commented in open court while the jury was deliberating that there was no real evidence that Jim had exposed himself. Sentencing was postponed until October. Jim's bail was raised to $50,000, and now he faced an almost certain prison sentence that could get the judge reelected as a Nixonian law and order enforcer. This new bail order came down on a Sunday evening so that it would be hard for Jim to make his bond and he could be jailed overnight. But Max Fink had been prepared for this. He had several certified bank checks in various amounts at the ready so the cops couldn't get Jim behind bars. The lawyers told Jim not to worry. They would win on appeal. Jim talked to the press after the verdict. "This won't affect my style," he told the Miami Herald. "I maintain I didn't do anything wrong." Max now told Jim to get out of Florida immediately. But Jim was in no hurry to get back to Los Angeles. Pamela had fallen apart and was in chronic heroin use. Pam was said by her friends to have been suicidally depressed in Jim's absence. Jim now elected to drive back to California with Babe Hill for company, and they took their sweet time. Jim wanted to visit his old haunts, so they stopped in Clearwater, where Jim had been in junior college. Both got thrown in jail for a few hours when Jim started a bar fight. Let loose, they drove on to Tallahassee, where an unusually nostalgic Jim stopped at the motel where he had lived as an FSU student. Then they drove straight to New Orleans, where they tarried for a few days and got in Babe's words, as drunk as a couple of walruses. Touring the city, Jim bought a postcard at St. Louis Cathedral and mailed it to the Doors office. "Don't worry," he wrote, "the end is near." Haha. Jim visited Congo Square, site of the old slave market and the place where African rhythms were first heard in America. One night he got up and jammed the blues with one of the bar bands in the French Quarter, thanking them politely when he'd sung his fill. These musicians later mutated into Kansas, a successful touring band of the early 70s. In Tennessee, Jim and Babe got busted at a speed trap. They had to follow the cop to the county courthouse where the judge let them go for $100 in cash. In October of 1970, Jim Morrison drove into a Los Angeles scored dry by the easterly Santa Ana winds. "I see your hair is burning," he wrote. "Hills are filled with fire. If they say I never loved you, you know they are a liar." End quote. Now, as discussed, on October 30th of 1970, Jim was sentenced to 6 months in jail, but managed to stay out on appeal. However, by March of 1971, Jim had left the U.S. forever, moving with his longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend Pamela Corson to France. It wasn't supposed to be a permanent relocation, but of course Jim died in Paris on July 3rd, 1971. To this day, there is still some controversy and mystery around his death. For instance, in accordance with certain French regulations, an autopsy was never performed on Jim's body, and the circumstances around his death were also a bit shady. The official ruling says Jim died of a heart attack, but many people, myself included, question the official ruling. Some people even go as far as claiming Jim is still alive somewhere. I'm not going to go into that conspiracy today, but in this video, I will be taking a very deep look into the details of Jim's last day alive and the fallout from his death. I'm also going to be taking a look at how the Doors carried on after Jim's death, how his death impacted the Doors and the people around the Doors both professionally and personally. I'll be taking a look at some of the lawsuits, various legal proceedings, some of the tensions within the Doors world, and some of the more positive things too. Before I jump into any one particular area, the following is a general overview of what happened after Jim Morrison's death. Jim Morrison is one of the most iconic singers in the history of rock and roll, and was the face of the Doors so much so that when it came to the band, for many, he's the only name that comes to mind. Yet, the Doors were so much more than just Jim Morrison. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore were all key pieces to the band. After Jim Morrison's untimely death in July of 1971, the 3 surviving members actually continued as a band until the end of their contract with Elektra. Their contract with Elektra Records ended in January of 1973. During this post-Jim Morrison period, the Doors released 2 albums with Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger taking over the vocals. These albums were Other Voices, released on October 18, 71, and Full Circle, released on August 15, 72. When it comes to the first post-Jim Morrison Doors record, Other Voices, it should be noted that that album was intended to include Jim Morrison originally before he died. Work had begun on that album by the rest of the band in California while Jim was living in France with Pamela Corson, his longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend. The band had originally hoped for Jim to return from France on time to complete the record. It should be noted, however, that at this point in time, Jim had actually left the Doors and was starting a new chapter in his life, though there was still some hope he may rejoin the band. The thought of reconnecting with the Doors had seriously crossed Jim Morrison's mind as well. In any case, neither Other Voices or Full Circle met the level of critical or commercial success the previous 6 records with Jim Morrison did. For instance, all 6 previous studio records with Jim Morrison reached the top 10 in the US, whereas the 2 post-Morrison records didn't. In any case, these 2 post-Morrison records are appreciated by many fans as an artistic expression of the 3 surviving members of the band. On November 17, 1978, a 3rd record was released in the post-Morrison era. This album is called An American Prayer, or as Doors producer Paul Rothchild calls the album, The Rape of Jim Morrison. Later in this video, I'm going to read to you a quote from Paul Rothchild where he explains why he is so critical of An American Prayer and why he considers it the, quote, rape of Jim Morrison. The backstory to An American Prayer is essentially the following. The 3 surviving members of the band reconnected in 1978 to record music for many of Jim Morrison's spoken word recordings. Thus, this 3rd post-Jim Morrison record does actually feature Jim. There is also a live version of the Doors track Roadhouse Blues which appears on this album. A remastered version of An American Prayer was released in 1995 featuring bonus tracks. The band reconnected again in 1997 to add music to another one of Jim Morrison's recordings, Orange County Suite, a piece Jim had written about Pamela Corson. 4 years earlier, in 1993, the Doors were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam performed on vocals for the induction ceremony alongside Ray Manzarek, John Densmore, Robbie Krieger, and another guest musician, Don Was. Don playing bass on the 3 songs the band performed that night, Roadhouse Blues, Break On Through, and Light My Fire. In the year 2000, the Doors once again reconnected for another live performance, this time for the VH1 program VH1 Storytellers. Several prominent guest vocalists took part in this performance. Scott Weiland from Stone Temple Pilots, Scott Stapp from Creed, Perry Farrell from Jane's Addiction, Patrick Monaghan, Travis Meeks, and arguably most importantly, Ian Astbury of The Cult. More on Ian momentarily. Throughout the 2000s, the surviving members of the band continued to have various collaborations with other artists, including the song Breakin' a Sweat by Skrillex, a song which features the surviving members of the band and a vocal sample of an interview with Jim Morrison. The most notable Doors collaboration of the 21st century, however, in my opinion, would have to be the Doors of the 21st Century, one of the names Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger toured under. The Doors of the 21st Century featured Ian Astbury on lead vocals for some time, as well as various other prominent vocalists over the years. The band The Doors of the 21st Century was formed in 2002 by Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger. However, John Densmore did not partake in this new band. And, after legal battles of the usage of the Doors name with John Densmore in 2003, Ray and Robbie changed the band name several times until finally settling on Manzarek Krieger. They would sometimes appear also as Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger of the Doors. John Densmore has said that he would not partake in this new band unless Eddie Vedder were to take over the lead vocals. John Densmore has made it clear that in his opinion, Eddie is one of the few vocalists on par with Jim Morrison's vocal abilities. The group Manzarek Krieger lasted until 2013, when Ray Manzarek tragically passed away from complications related to bile duct cancer on May 20th of that year. On February 12, 2016, Robbie Krieger and John Densmore came together with various other musicians for a concert in Ray's memory entitled A Celebration for Ray Manzarek. All proceeds from this concert went to the charitable program Stand Up to Cancer. In short, many new chapters have been added to the Doors' legacy long after the end of the band. In total, the Doors recorded 9 studio records, 6 while Jim was alive and 3 afterwards. The Doors are rightfully regarded as one of the most influential bands in rock and roll history, and Jim Morrison in particular is one of the most influential figures in popular music. Now, of course, part of the legend of Jim Morrison, so to speak, comes from the fact that he died tragically at the infamous age of 27, following the likes of Robert Johnson, Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin. It should be noted that Jim Morrison's longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend Pamela Courson, the last person known to see Jim Morrison alive, also died at the age of 27. At the time of Jim's death on July 3, 1971, Pamela was 24. She passed away about 3 years later on April 25, 1974. The cause of her death was a heroin overdose. Officially, Jim Morrison's death is listed as heart failure, though it is believed by many that the actual cause of death was also a heroin overdose. There are other unverified theories about Jim Morrison's death as well. In any case, Jim Morrison is buried in Paris at the Père Lachaise Cemetery, while Pamela Courson was cremated at Fairhaven Memorial Park in Santa Ana, California. When it comes to Jim Morrison in particular, his gravesite in Paris has become a significant tourist attraction. Fans of his and the Doors make pilgrimages from all over the world to see him. So much so that there have been instances where the number of fans visiting his gravesite were in such huge numbers that scuffles had broken out between fans and local law enforcement. Throughout Jim's life, he rejected authority and had several run-ins with law enforcement himself. It's fitting then that this type of chaos would occur at his resting place. End quote. In a few minutes, I'm going to read to you a quote from Jim Morrison, Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis, where the immediate fallout of Jim Morrison's death is discussed. But before I do that, I want to jump back to what I was saying about producer Paul Rothchild and An American Prayer. Paul Rothchild produced the Doors' first 5 studio records, as well as their live album Absolutely Live and their compilation record 13. He was originally going to produce LA Woman as well, but he left the project early on. More on that later. In any case, Paul Rothchild was instrumental in the Doors' success. He was close with Jim and was highly critical of An American Prayer. He considered An American Prayer disrespectful to Jim Morrison's legacy and integrity as an artist. The following is a quote from Paul Rothchild where he elaborates on why he opposes An American Prayer as strongly as he does. This quote is from an interview Paul did with journalist Blair Jackson on July 3, 1981, 10 years to the day of Jim Morrison's death. Quote, I think anything that was done during Jim's lifetime that might have offended him would disappear in total insignificance compared to what I'm positive would have been his reaction to An American Prayer. That album is a rape of Jim Morrison. It was heavily edited. I have a tape of Jim reading most of the poetry in the style and meter that he intended. Jim and I discussed poetry a great deal. I got him to listen to poets like Dylan Thomas reading his own works, and Jim definitely got things out of it. Jim was always talking to me about the progress of words, their meter, their sequence, their flow. He was very concerned about how he presented his poetry. When I listen to that original tape, I hear something compelling. To Doors fans, and there are a few who've heard it, the poetry is chilling. To me, what was done on An American Prayer is the same as taking a Picasso and cutting it up into postage stamp-sized pieces, spreading it across a supermarket wall. All Jim's poetry has been cut into bits and spread across a long instrumental composition that is irrelevant. Jim never intended this kind of approach to be done with his poetry. When we went into the studio to record it, it was to get away from the Doors. In a way, it was his signal to the other Doors that he was moving away from them. He definitely wouldn't have used Doors music. He was talking to people as diverse as Lalo Schifrin, whom he wanted to write some very avant-garde classical music. He wanted it to be sparsely orchestrated. I think An American Prayer is rude. The Doors and Danny and me, anyone involved, should be concerned with preserving the integrity of the Doors' career and the memory of Jim. We should all tell the truth. An American Prayer was an embarrassment. It was the first commercial sellout of Jim Morrison. Jim would be humiliated by it as a sensitive person, and incensed by it as a poet. Damage is done, I'm afraid. Let's all hope that this sort of thing doesn't happen again, though, because it takes the Doors farther away from what they really were, one of the all-time great rock and roll bands, and the proof is already out there for everyone to see. We don't need any more convincing. End quote. Now, before I discuss the immediate fallout of Jim's death, I want to take a quick look at the last album Jim Morrison ever made. As mentioned, Paul Rothchild was originally supposed to produce LA Woman, the last record the Doors made during Jim's lifetime, but Paul left the project early on. LA Woman was recorded from parts of December of 1970 to January of 1971. This quote from Paul Rothchild is from 10 years after Jim Morrison's death in July of 1981. Quote, I went to rehearsals with the Doors for about a month. They were set up in the basement of their offices on Santa Monica Boulevard, but it was a joke. They'd come straggling in. Jim wouldn't even show up half the time. There was no enthusiasm at all. They were drugged on their own boredom, just totally bummed out. Ray would try to get things together. He has this great enthusiasm. Still does. I love that man. John was really angry about Jim's attitude, and Robbie sort of laughed at it and said, that's Jim. It wasn't just Jim, though. They'd all been lazy. They only had 4 or 5 songs that were even defined enough to play as songs at that point. The most complete were LA Woman and Riders on the Storm, both of which I thought were great, great songs. My problem was I couldn't get them to play either of them decently. It was like trying to watch a 90-year-old man trying to run the marathon. There was simply nothing there. There was no energy. They couldn't have played Stormy Weather. Their heart wasn't in it, and it was easy to see why. Jim's heart wasn't in it. We rehearsed and rehearsed, but it didn't get any better. Finally, I said, let's go into the studio. We've got to make a record sometime. I figured I'd be able to do it like the last few records, patch together the best stuff. Ray would be a great cheerleader, and we'd finally get this thing going. Well, we went into the studio, and it was dreadful. Wall-to-wall boredom. Jim wasn't into it at all. He'd get into this spoiled brat thing and drag everything down deliberately. It was the military kid showing his father what a punk he could be. It was that simple. I'd work my butt off for a week, but it was still just awful. I'd go and tell them that, hoping that it would make them angry enough to do something good. This isn't rock and roll, it's cocktail lounge music. But they didn't have any heart anymore. You know, it got so bad that for the first time in my career, I found myself drifting off to sleep, putting my head on the console and nodding off. It was just bad. Capital B, capital A, capital D, bad. I finally turned to engineer Bruce Botnick and said, I know another producer would stick with this because it's $250,000 for the producer, but I can't do it. The reason I went into production was I love music, but I cannot prostitute myself. This is whoring. I went into the studio finally and said, guys, I think the best thing that could happen is for me to leave, because you've become too reliant on me to come up with the energy and the ideas and the direction, and I just don't want to do it anymore. The only way you'll survive is if you make this record yourself. You'll have to generate the enthusiasm and the brilliance. They freaked. Robbie got pale. Ray sat down heavily. Jim turned around and walked to the other side of the studio. John looked like he was going to have a coronary. What are we going to do? They asked. I said, you've seen how I work. Bruce has seen me do it for years. Use that as a jumping off point and make your own Doors record. because if I put together what I've got and presented it to a company, we couldn't even get a deal. We said a very warm and tender and loving goodbye, and I left. If Jim were still alive, we'd still be making poetry records together. The Doors did go on to produce their own record with Bruce, and from it came 2 excellent cuts, LA Woman and Riders on the Storm, the 2 that have been excellent in rehearsal. As far as I'm concerned, you can take the entire rest of the record and throw it in the garbage can. I think it's terrible. Love Her Madly was the song I was talking about when I said it sounded like cocktail music. That's the song that drove me out the studio. That it sold 1 million copies means nothing to me. It's still bad music." End quote. Now let's discuss what happened following Jim Morrison's death. Jim Morrison officially died of heart failure, though that has been contested by many who believe he actually died of heroin. More on that later. In any case, for now, let's take a look at the immediate impact of Jim Morrison's death on the Doors and the people around them. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life, Death, Legend by Stephen Davis. Quote, "The Doors didn't survive long after Jim died. Ray Manzarek was angry that Bill Siddons, the manager, hadn't insisted on seeing Jim's body, and for years Ray seemed not to believe that Jim was actually dead. Jim was seen in Paris, in Tangier, in New Orleans, and San Francisco within a year of his death. But when Jim didn't show up to the Doors sessions in the autumn of 1971, they figured he really was out of the band. They recorded 2 more albums as a trio and disbanded after the final show in September of 1972. Robbie Krieger summed up the fate of the Doors after Jim passed on with the following: "For a long time, it was the 3 of us against Jim. When we didn't have Jim, we fought among ourselves." End quote. In 1977, Elektra's engineer John Haney rediscovered Jim Morrison's poetry tapes. Using recordings mostly from 1969 and incorporating vocals from other sources, Elektra released An American Prayer as a Jim Morrison/Doors album in late 1978. It was actually a posthumous George Morrison album with new music that sounded like the Doors circa LA Woman. An enclosed album booklet reproduced Jim's notebook entries and doodled scrawls. An American Prayer was really just a shallow pastiche. Both the mellow power of Jim's vocal delivery and his surreal imagery were diluted by music aptly described by critics as cocktail jazz. Doors' longtime producer Paul Rothchild, who didn't work on the album, called An American Prayer the rape of Jim Morrison. The end of the 70s and the 10th anniversary of Jim's death saw an uptick in the Morrison legend. Francis Ford Coppola used his former classmate's epic, The End, to bracket his Vietnam War masterpiece Apocalypse Now, reminding people of the Doors' crucial role as an echo of the era's turmoil and violence. To coincide with Apocalypse Now's 1980 release, Elektra put out a 4th Doors compilation album, The Doors' Greatest Hits, that shocked the label by quickly selling 2 million units to a generation too young to have seen the band. These high school kids also put the first biography of Jim Morrison on the bestseller list for months that year. The manuscript of No One Gets Out Alive, which had been researched by Jerry Hopkins, had been rejected by every major publisher. The text was then reworked by Danny Sugarman and reportedly Ray Manzarek to include material that only Doors insiders knew about. Published in 1980, the biography, the first of a major 60s rock star, was an instant success. It cemented in the public mind the image of Jim Morrison as a poetic wild man, a rebel, and a tragic American legend. The book ended stupidly with the suggestion that Jim Morrison might have faked his death and might still be alive in hiding. Jim Morrison's real friends knew that this was an impossibility. There was, they insisted, no possible way that Jim would have ever allowed Pamela Corson to suffer as she did, due to all the turmoil that followed his death, if he had any means to prevent it. In 1985, Bono was doing Jim Morrison impressions during performances with his band U2. In that year, the Doors released a video compilation, Dance on Fire, that recycled some of Jim's more shamanic moves from Feast of Friends. For the first time, younger fans could see the roiling tumult and mania that had characterized Jim's performances with the Doors. In 1986, at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, where no tombstone protected his uncovered, seemingly abandoned dirt grave, 2 people were caught trying to dig up Jim. The estate then finally placed a large granite cube over the soil with Jim's name and dates inscribed on the stone. Then a Yugoslav sculptor took it upon himself to install a bust of Jim on the gravestone. This lasted for about a year, defaced with paint and lipstick until it was stolen. Until this day, Jim's grave has remained an important stop for the International Hippie Trail, as young backpackers and nomads included Père Lachaise in their European itineraries. Scabrous, desecrating graffiti throughout the cemetery pointed the way to the obscure grave where kids gathered to strum guitars, smoke dope, light candles, read Jim's poems aloud, drink wine, and leave offerings. of flowers, joints, snapshots, demo tapes, letters, cheap plastic lighters by the thousands. There was a major riot in Paris on July 3, 1991, the 20th anniversary of Jim Morrison's death. The Soviet Union had collapsed 2 years earlier, and the Iron Curtain that separated Eastern Europe from the West had come down. That summer, several thousand former inmates of European communism headed to Paris to visit Jim's grave on his death day. They'd been listening to him for almost 25 years with no way to make contact. By noon on July 3rd, 1,000 Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Latvians, and Russians were mobbing the gravesite. They were drinking vodka, smoking dope, eating, fighting, fornicating on the surrounding tombstones, and just grooving. Jim would have loved it. By 3 in the afternoon, 2,000 more Moldovans, Georgians, Ukrainians, Romanians, even possibly Armenians, even though there already was a large Armenian community in France due to many of them escaping to France after the Armenian genocide, they all gathered and chased away the guards. The authorities grew alarmed and herded everyone out by closing time at 5 o'clock. The huge crowds waiting outside couldn't get in to pay homage to their rock idol. The party continued outside the gates when 3,000 people sat down in the street. As night fell, the crowd lit bonfires. Everyone got loaded. Jim's songs were chanted in strange accents. At midnight, the crowd set fire to a parked car and tried to ram it through the gates of Père Lachaise so they could hang out with Jim. Suddenly, the CRS, the dreaded French riot police, were on top of them. There was mass panic, clouds of tear gas, blood in the streets, many wrecked cars, and 100 injuries after the riot cops in the black leather raincoats had sorted out Jim's unruly fans from the former Warsaw Pact. By then, many places where the Doors had once played no longer existed. The clubs had closed, the psychedelic ballrooms had vanished, and most of the arenas had been torn down or redeveloped. Quote-unquote traditional rock itself had died out by the early 90s and was replaced by alternative and grunge music that began in Seattle. Hundreds of radio stations in America changed their formats to the newer bands: Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots. The older rock bands survived on classic rock radio stations that soon grew into regional powerhouses, purely on demographic lines. The Doors became staples of classic rock radio, with such late-period masterpieces as L.A. Woman, Riders on the Storm, and Peace Frog continuing to dominate station request lines to this day. Jim always wanted to be huge, Robbie Krieger said recently. He wanted it to be like the Beatles, with girls falling out of the sky. But it was never like that in those days. But if Jim were here today, he would love it. Because right now, it's like Beatles, Stones, and Doors, you know? By the end of the 20th century, the Doors had sold more than 50 million records. In 1994, the Doors were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. At the annual induction ceremony held at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, the surviving Doors were joined by Jim's sister, Ann Morrison, who accepted her brother's honor on behalf of the Morrison family. Eddie Vedder, the charismatic lead singer of Pearl Jam, joined the Doors later to sing Jim's parts on Roadhouse Blues, Break On Through, and Light My Fire. The Doors drifted further apart. John Densmore's 1990 memoir, Riders on the Storm, recounted the Doors' career through the eyes of the band's horrified drummer. Ray Manzarek's 1998 memoir, Light My Fire, lashed back at Densmore and confirmed Manzarek as a 60s ideologue with little sense of humor, an absurd myth to evangelize, and many axes to grind. Densmore responded in 2002 with an article in The Nation where he defended his continued stubborn refusal to sanction the band's classic songs for extremely lucrative commercial exploitation. John Densmore declared himself the rightful legatee of Jim Morrison's anarchic stance as an American artist of conscience and someone who had never sold out. Through all of this, well into the 90s, Jim Morrison rested quietly in his grave. His fans, however, continued to run amok in Père Lachaise, holding daily pot parties and jam sessions over his tomb, until the cemetery was forced to clamp down after Oliver Stone's movie about the Doors moved the situation into crisis mode. The cemetery's director complained to the Paris press that the situation was getting out of hand. There were reports that Jim would be dug up and evicted when the 30-year gravesite lease expired, unless his estate paid for erasing all the graffiti on the surrounding tombs and provided security for his grave. Sometime in 1995, the estate cleaned up Père Lachaise and established a fund for a permanent security detail. A large bronze plaque was attached to Jim's gravestone. It bore a Greek inscription which can be translated as "True to His Own Spirit." In 2003, Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger regrouped without John Densmore, who refused to participate. They recruited the former Police drummer Stuart Copeland and British rocker Ian Astbury from The Cult to fill out the new Doors. They played sold-out shows in Los Angeles and had a Hells Angels party in Vegas before lawsuits brought by Densmore and Jim's estate forced them to stop calling themselves The Doors. Then Copeland broke an arm in a bicycle accident and successfully sued The Doors for loss of income when they replaced him with another drummer so they could tour. Ray and Robbie pressed on with Ian Astbury, a bass player and a drummer, playing under the street legal name The Doors of the 21st Century. They toured America, often playing for packed houses of old Doors fans and young classic rockers. Ian Astbury's brilliant impersonation of Jim Morrison enabled the band to play the LA Woman songs for the first time in concert. The shows often began with Roadhouse Blues and When the Music's Over, casting an almost Trace-like spell over the audiences. Astbury looked like a cleaned-up Jim Morrison might have looked at the age of 45 and sang respectful, precise interpretations of Jim's classic songs. A time-tripping, psychedelic light show played on a big screen behind the band, providing visual references to the Doors' old jams. The Doors of the 21st Century played sold-out shows in Paris in December of 2003. On December 8th, which would have been Jim's 60th birthday, they visited him at Père Lachaise. They lit candles along dozens of fans and tourists crowding the gravesite. The little ceremony was monitored by a pair of security cameras and 2 uniformed guards, who discouraged the hundreds of rock pilgrims paying homage to Jim from playing music, drinking wine, smoking dope, or sitting on the nearby tombs. The security precautions remained necessary because at the end of that year, the French tourism authorities announced that Jim Morrison's grave was, more than 30 years later after his death, still one of the most heavily visited tourist sites in Paris. End quote. Now, no conversation about Jim's death can be complete without discussing Pamela Courson. Jim and Pamela, of course, were living together in Paris at the time of Jim's death, and Pamela is the last person known to have seen Jim alive. Pamela was using heroin, and Jim is said to have taken some of Pam's heroin that night, apparently mistaking it initially for cocaine. Pamela's main supplier was her other on-again, off-again boyfriend, Jean de Breteuil, a rich French count who, by the way, is said to have also supplied the heroin which killed Janis Joplin. In any case, Jim was not used to heroin, and according to many, it was the heroin that night which did ultimately kill him. Officially, Jim Morrison's death is listed as heart failure, but unofficially, many people believe it was heroin. More on that later. In any case, Pamela Courson was Jim Morrison's live-in girlfriend, and after Jim's death, Pamela made the case that she was actually Jim's common-law wife. Being Jim Morrison's widow would have legal ramifications when it came to Jim Morrison's estate. The following is from Doors biographer Jerry Hopkins. Quote, in 1971, 4 months after Jim died, in an effort to bolster her claim and to be granted an allowance and an advance from the estate, which was still then in probate, Pam filed a, quote, declaration in support of widow's allowance, claiming that all time since September 30th of 67, I have considered that I was married to James D. Morrison, and that I was in fact his wife at the time of his death and am now his widow. It was in 1967, as Light My Fire was finally dropping off the charts, that Pam said she and Jim spent a night in Colorado Springs. Earlier, she had Jim ask Doors lawyer Max Fink which U.S. states had the loosest laws recognizing common law marriage. In her court statement, Pam said, quote, Jim reported to me that he learned from an attorney that to create a marriage in the state of Colorado, it was sufficient if 2 people stayed together, had marital relations, and agreed to thereby be husband and wife, if, in fact, they thereafter conducted and held themselves out as each other's spouse. Jim and I spent the night at a hotel, had sexual relations, and agreed that we would forever be husband and wife. We very briefly honeymooned in Colorado, and then continued our Doors tour. In December of 1971, the 3 surviving Doors filed papers of their own in court, making claims against the Morrison estate. Then, in April of 74, the Doors came back with another lawsuit. Eventually, a compromise was reached, though. Then, as the final accounting of the estate was being made, Pam died. A heroin overdose on April 25, 1971. If she had lived, she would have received about $500,000 right away, plus a quarter of everything the Doors would make in the future, a sum that subsequently proved to be worth millions. Pam died without a will, which meant her quarter share of all future Doors earnings went to her next of kin, her parents. Almost immediately, Jim's parents entered the fray, demanding their fair share as stated in the California Probate Code. On January 10, 1975, the 2 sets of parents signed an agreement dividing equally the proceeds from Jim's quarter share of all Doors revenue. But it was 1979 before all the loose ends were tied up and the parents started receiving any money. End quote. As discussed, Pamela Courson made the legal argument that she was Jim Morrison's common-law wife. A fact about Jim that is often not given much attention is that Jim was actually married, but not to Pamela. In January of 1969, Jim Morrison was interviewed by Patricia Kennelly, the editor-in-chief of Jazz and Pop magazine in New York City. They eventually became a couple, and in June of 1970, they were married. Their marriage was a long-distance one, with Jim being in Los Angeles and Patricia in New York. Despite the marriage, Jim continued to be with other women, as Patricia discusses in a quote I'm going to share with you. Though the two never officially divorced, they had broken up several months before Jim's death in July of 1971. In the following quote, Patricia discusses the last time she saw Jim Morrison, which was in February of 1971 in Los Angeles. In this story, Patricia ends up beating up another girl who was after Jim Morrison. Quote, I went to a recording session with my girlfriend, with whom I have been staying, and she made a play for Jim. I said, oh, that's a no-no. Wait until I leave. I don't care what you do, but not in front of me, please. I didn't care what Jim did. He was a complete polygamist. But she was really drunk, and Jim was easily lured away. She went to the bathroom, and 5 minutes later, Jim left. I found them embracing outside on the lawn. I walked over and said, get up. Jim was smiling. He thought it was funny. I said, come on up, both of you, up. But instead, the girl reaches up and pulls me down. I say, let me talk to him by myself. She went away. And he said, listen, I'm too drunk to do anything tonight. Just let me be with her. I said, look, it's my last night in LA. I'm going home tomorrow, and I'll probably never see you again. He said, well, I'm not going to spend another night with you. And I said, fine with me, but you're not going to spend it with her either. He got disgusted and went inside, and she came over and I said, I'm going to break your neck. She said, don't hurt me, it's not my fault. Then we go to a bar, where Jim tells her I'm a frustrated lesbian, and I go bananas. Absolutely bananas. We went back to her house and had a scene in the bathroom, where I told her to cool it, and she said, well, you've always known how fond I was of him. And I said, you jerk. You always told me it was the singer Chris Christopherson you were after. She then pushed me backwards and I fell into the bathtub. I got out of the tub, grabbed her by her hair, and slammed her into the side of the sink. I was going for her eyes when Morrison came in saying, now ladies. We left the bathroom and Jim started going through all the drawers in the apartment. We asked him what he was looking for, and he said, oh, I'm looking for knives and scissors, so you can't castrate me. We were flabbergasted. We didn't know what to do, so we watched him gather up all the sharp things in the house and put them under the couch. Then he laid on the couch and said he didn't think he had anything to do with the whole thing. He said he thought it was between us two, and then he passed out. She suggested we go outside to talk, so we wouldn't wake him up. Then proposed we share him, so we could keep him from the groupies and those who didn't really care for him. I saw red. I've never been that angry. It was like looking through red cellophane. I screamed, I'm going to kill you. I grabbed her, threw her down the stairs, gave her a couple of punches, threw her up against the wall, and she said, I don't want to fight you. I said, fight or I'll kill you. So she gave me a powder puff punch, and I went into a real rage, giving her a karate number with my foot in her stomach. Then I started punching her in the face, and finally, I went away. Just like that. It was over, and I was drained. I told her to take me to the airport, and I got on a plane to New York that morning. End quote. The following is another quote from Patricia where she discusses a conversation she had with Pamela Courson. In December of 1970, Patricia visited Los Angeles and stayed with Diane Gardner, the Doors publicist and a friend of the band. Diane was living at the time below Jim and Pam's apartment. Upon arriving in Los Angeles in December of 1970, Patricia left a message for Jim at the Doors office. Quote, Jim called half an hour later. Pam was upstairs at the time. The Doors were recording LA Woman and he asked me to come to the session. I said recording sessions bore me, so why not come here? He said okay and didn't show up. I didn't hear from him for 3 or 4 days. I was at home alone, the phone rings and it's some girl calling for Pam. Jim and Pam didn't have a phone. So I got Pam and I said, I met you once at the Hilton in New York and we had dinner with some people. Pam was really stoned and said, yeah, whatever happened to that chick, Pat Connolly? I said, Pamela, that's me. We ended up talking for 3 hours and got really stoned and drunk and things got said. There were no ill feelings. It was very lovely and very weird. End quote. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life, Death, Legend by Stephen Davis, where he discusses Pamela Courson's death and the subsequent legal fallout. Quote, Pamela Courson returned to Los Angeles a few days after Jim died and proceeded to play out a 3-year Ophelia-like mad scene. Reliable information about Pamela from this period is often unsupported and scarce since she lived in a demi-mundane life in a shadowy milieu of addiction, grief, and occasional mania. After recovering from her Parisian ordeal, she tried to resume her life in LA as Pamela Morrison. She talked to her dog as if she was talking to Jim. She always spoke of Jim in the present as if he were alive. The accountant informed her that Jim's estate, to which she was indeed the sole heir, could not continue to support her boutique, Themis, until the will was adjudicated, which could go on for years. Themis would have to close. Pamela became so enraged by this that she drove a car into the front window of the store. In November of 1971, she filed papers formally claiming the Jim Morrison estate, which was reported to include holdings in oil wells and California ranch land. The other doors immediately sued Jim's estate for what they claimed were large outstanding cash advances that had been paid to Jim. The ensuing litigation left Pamela almost penniless. Pamela relocated to the Bay Area in 1972. She stayed in Bolinas with Ellen Sander for a while. Then she lived with some friends in Sausalito. Racked by crippling spasms of guilt, she would sit for hours by the telephone waiting for my old man to call. Ray Manzarek ran into her in Sausalito and wanted to ask her what happened in Paris. But when she saw him, she swooned in a paroxysm of grief and could only weep in his arms. A bit later, she contacted Jim's literary friend Michael McClure about Jim's remaining poetry. She loaned him the leather portmanteau, which she described as a doctor's bag that contained Jim's poems and notes, each filled in a binder and carefully arranged. McClure later returned the bag, expressing surprise at what he later called a miracle of order, and told Pamela that he felt the works could be published. Eventually, Pamela returned to Los Angeles. She had affairs with a younger rock star and an older French diplomat. She continued to have serious cash flow problems and a taste for heroin. To survive, she sold her jewelry, Jim's books, and anything that wasn't nailed down, though she managed to keep her small collection of Luger pistols. She was evicted from her house in the Hollywood Hills for non-payment of rent and moved into a garden apartment in West Hollywood. Paul Rothschild said that she used to turn up at his house at all hours, well supplied with barbiturates and heroin. She spent much of her time with Paul Rothschild crying. She kept saying over and over, "I just couldn't control him." Pamela had a lot of enemies. Some believed she had killed Jim Morrison for his money. There were people who were content to see her in extreme distress. They put out rumors that she was prostituting herself, but tracking these rumors always leads back to people who hated her. She may have been kept for a time by the rich Frenchman. Others swore or wrote in thinly sourced books that Pamela had confessed to killing Jim accidentally, that he had snorted massive lines of what she told him was cocaine, but which was actually China White. No one put it past her or stood up to say that it couldn't have happened. The Doors litigated Pamela for years. She had no money at all and had to be supported by family and friends. Lawsuits flew like bats at sunset until early 1974, when it looked like there would be finally a settlement. Then the Doors sued the estate again, prolonging the agony. In April, the court recognized Pamela as James Douglas Morrison's lawful heir, and a full settlement was reached with the Doors. Pamela's initial cash disbursement, hurried through to relieve obvious financial distress, was $20,000. Friends say Pamela seemed a little better after things were settled. Others say she was more despondent than ever. She bought a cherry chrome yellow Volkswagen Beetle. She went to Saks Fifth Avenue and bought a Monogram Ranch mink stole. She phoned her connection and reportedly ordered an ounce of China White. The people she lived with found her dead on the living room couch on the afternoon of April 25, 1974. At first, they thought she was just taking a nap and let her sleep for hours until it began to get weird. Then, they noticed she wasn't breathing. The cops arrived. A man living in the house who said he used to drive for Jim and Pamela was questioned about Pamela's use of heroin. He volunteered that her quote-unquote husband had died of a heroin overdose in Paris 3 years earlier and that Pamela had recently spoken about looking forward to seeing him again soon. When they took her away, her long red hair cascaded over the side of the gurney as she was being lifted into the ambulance. The coroner could have called Pamela's death a suicide, but called it a massive pulmonary edema instead. The autopsy noted that she had a severe bladder infection. Ray Manzarek was asked to play at a memorial service for both Pamela and Jim, organized by the Corsons at Forest Lawn Cemetery on Monday, April 29th. Ray played When the Music's Over, Love Street, and Crystal Ship. Pamela's apartment was burglarized during the ceremony, and an unknown amount of Jim's effects were reportedly stolen. It is not known whether there was talk of burying Pamela's ashes with Jim in Paris, but they were later interred in a memory wall under the name Pamela Morrison in an Orange County cemetery. A week later, a probate judge officially awarded Pamela $500,000 and a quarter of the Doors' future royalty income, making the dead girl a virtual millionaire. It later emerged that her family suspected that Pamela might have been murdered, with suspicion reportedly following on a former in-law member of the Morrison family. An investigation produced no actionable results. Since Pamela had died without leaving a will, Jim Morrison's entire estate, including the executorship of his literary and artistic remains, passed to Pamela's parents, Corky and Marie Corson. Sometime after Jim Morrison's father, Admiral Morrison, retired from the Navy in 1975, the Morrisons sued for a share of their son's legacy. Several years later, a settlement awarded the Morrisons half of the financial worth of the estate, but left Jim's artistic legacy in the control of the Corsons. End quote. I'm going to read to you one more quote from Jim Morrison, Life, Death, Legend, where Stephen Davis discusses Jim Morrison's last days in Paris. But before I do that, I want to read to you something else specifically about Jim's death. The circumstances around Jim Morrison's death are shady. The official story is that Jim Morrison died of heart failure early in the morning on July 3, 1971, while he was taking a bath. At the time, he was living in an apartment with his longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend Pamela Corson in Paris. Now, several people who knew Jim Morrison have gone on record saying that the circumstances around his death were much darker. According to them, the official version leaves out a lot of important information, and as far as some are concerned, the official version isn't accurate at all. It is important to note that no autopsy was conducted. It wasn't required by French law. In this video, I'm going to read to you a quote from Jerry Hopkins. Jerry Hopkins was a journalist who wrote extensively about Jim Morrison over the years. One of the areas he researched about Jim Morrison in particular was his death. Quote, I was living in London in 1972, the following year, and I visited Paris several times in my search for information. The stories I was told about Jim's death were confusing. The one I heard most often was that Jim died of a heroin overdose in a nightclub called the Rock and Roll Circus. This is a version I heard repeatedly during my interviews, and later was confirmed by sources in the junkie underground talking to Hervé Muller, a French journalist who picked up some of the threads of the story after I returned to the US. Junkies are generally not known for their reliability. Usually, they are anxious to say anything they think the listener wants to hear. In exchange, they hope for enough money to score another bag of relief. None of the sources Hervé talked to were paid for information beyond the cost of the coffee at some sidewalk cafe. Nor was any ulterior motive apparent, at least to Hervé or me. Junkies generally don't look for publicity, and there is little status to be gained amongst other junkies or anyone else to say you shared heroin with Jim Morrison the night he died of an overdose. Of course, there's always a chance that some nut made up the whole story, and that started going around. But the lack of contradiction on the basic points of the story is impressive. Nor does it seem that this version of Jim's death was a fabrication created to counter the official version. To the contrary, the official version, death by heart attack in a bathtub, seemed totally unknown in the junkie underground until its members were interviewed. Jim was familiar with the junkie underground, or at least aware of it, not because of Pamela's sporadic use of the drug, but because of the places in which he chose to drink. The most notable of these in Paris at the time was the Rock and Roll Circus, where the walls were covered with huge photographs of rock stars, wearing clown costumes. Earlier, this was the slickest rock club in Paris, where Led Zeppelin, Richie Havens, and Johnny Winter had played, but by the summer of 1971, it had slid close to the bottom. Rock and roll was still the music played, but now, most of the action wasn't on the dance floor, it was in the bathrooms. The circus was situated at 57 Rue de Seine, on the left bank near the river, and it backed up to a much more respectable club called the Alcazar. The Alcazar, at 62 Rue Mazarine, presented an expensive dinner spectacle of French music and scantily clad dancers, catering to a crowd of middle-aged French businessmen. The club was large, seating close to 1,000 patrons on 3 levels, surrounding a stage at 4 times the size of that of the more famous Latin Quarter. For some of the junkies in the Rock and Roll Circus, when the police would occasionally raid the club, the escape route was through the circus kitchen, which had a back door leading into the Alcazar's kitchen. It was a simple matter then to slip from the kitchen through the darkened club and onto the adjoining street without being noticed. According to information fathered by journalist Hervé Muller, one of the dealers on the scene in the summer of 1971 was a Chinese called Le Chinois. Supposedly, he had a laboratory for making heroin in Marseille, which explains why he happened to have such an unusually potent heroin to sell, running to about 30% pure as opposed to the customary 5 to 10%. Now, the way the story goes, Le Chinois, who was not known to use heroin himself, sold a quantity to a second-level dealer named Michel, who in turn sold a smaller quantity to someone called Le Petit Bernard, charging him $100. Bernard then sold that packet to Jim for about $200, warning him of the potency. "That's okay," Jim Morrison reportedly said. "I'm used to it." Now, all sources say Jim seemed to be nervous, upset. All sources also told Hervé Muller that the final transaction took place in the men's bathroom of the rock and roll circus, where Jim snorted the heroin and slumped into a comatose state. The junkies present heaved him onto his feet between them, then through the adjoining kitchens to the Alcazar and into a cab on the street. At this point, it is generally agreed that Jim was still alive. This is reasonable. In most heroin overdoses, the victim generally dies after 1 or 2 hours of lethargy, stupor, and coma. The way this story ends, Jim was returned to his flat and dumped into a bathtub full of cold water in an attempt to revive him. Standard treatment for an overdose, although there is some question about its practicality. That was one version of how Jim died. Of course, it wasn't the only one. In a second, far more innocent story, outlined in a statement given to Paris police the day Jim died, and thereafter described as the official version of the death, Pamela said that she and Jim returned to their flat from the movie theater at about 1 a.m., and that Jim died from heart complications while taking a bath. While writing my book, No One Here Gets Out Alive, I was also picking up other theories right, left, and sideways. Jim had been stabbed to death or killed by someone sticking pins in a voodoo doll. One story had his death part of a serpentine conspiracy connecting the deaths of the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, Jimi Hendrix, and others. Each was more ridiculous than the last. But I didn't believe the official story for a minute, and I didn't feel comfortable with Hervé Muller's carefully researched nightclub toilet overdose. So I reported the many scenarios, a long list that included the possibility that Jim wasn't dead at all, but merely living out an elaborately conceived and brilliantly executed hoax. I believed that this was something with Pamela's help that Jim could have pulled off. In any case, the years passed, and while I remained convinced that Jim was dead, I still didn't know what happened. At the same time, I came to believe that I might have neglected or at least underestimated and misunderstood Pamela's role in Jim's life. I re-interviewed Diane Gardner. Diane had been one of Pam's closest confidants in Los Angeles, and I figured that if anyone knew what happened, or at least what Pam said happened, it was Diane. She said that for several months, Pam walked around talking to herself, rambling and making no sense, and when she did make sense, she blamed herself for Jim's death. "I've never seen anyone feeling so guilty," Diane told me. She had tried to devote her whole life to one person. That was it. That was her life. Her whole life was him. And to have that kicked out from under you. As Diane and Pam spent more time together, fragments of the story came together, forming a believable scenario, explaining the source of Pam's guilt. Apparently, Jim and Pam had stopped at one or more sidewalk cafes on the way home from the movie, where Jim consumed several drinks. At home, Jim mixed another drink as Pam lined up some white powder on a tabletop. At this point, Diane is a bit vague. Jim had known about Pam's heroin use, but most agree that apparently he didn't know how frequently she used it. Diane told me that Pam seemed able to use it on a daily basis for a while, then merely stopped, suffering rarely from withdrawal. And, Diane said to her knowledge, Pam never used heroin with Jim or in his presence, at least until now. Jim disapproved of heroin. That was confirmed by everyone I talked to. Danny Sugarman, the 14-year-old high school student who hung out at the Doors office and 10 years later helped me get No One Here published, said Jim actually lectured him on the horrors and evils of heroin. So, Diane told me, when Jim saw Pam bent over a line of white powder, it is possible he thought it was cocaine. Jim liked cocaine. There is no reason to think he would have done anything but smile and join Pam on the couch and inhale the next line of powder. On the other hand, he could have sensed or realized that it was heroin. Diane told me that according to Pam, the talk about Jim's depression was real. His constant drinking only aggravated his depression. There is a theory that his death was a suicide. Diane doesn't dismiss that theory, at least not entirely. She told me that when Jim saw the powder lined up so neatly on the tabletop, he may have known it wasn't cocaine but heroin, and knew the dangers of what lay in its use, especially in combination with alcohol. Danny Sugarman told me a slightly different version of the same story. Danny said, "I seem to remember Pam saying something about Jim discovering her heroin. Jim dumped a quantity on the table, deftly pushing it into long, thick lines, probably with the edge of a paper matchbook or a credit card. He inhaled the first line. Apparently, Pam said, 'Jim, don't do too much. Don't do too much.' Instead of saying, 'Jim, it's smack,' because she had been hiding it from him and she knew very well he did not do that. And he did not want her to do it. He saw what heroin did to people. He knew the hazards of it. So, I remember a feeling of guilt from Pam. and an implication that Jim had discovered her stash and Pam said, "Oh, Jim, it's just coke," which he wasn't really into at that point anyway. And Jim said, "Let's do some." He put it out and snorted it like it was coke. Danny insisted that he didn't know the true story because this was only one of many that Pamela told, and the one she told most consistently, the official version of a heart attack in a bathtub, is, however, the version he believes. A variation of this story was told by Alain Ronay and Agnes Varda, friends of Jim's in France, to Paris Match magazine in 1991. In this version, Pamela took Ronay's arm in the Paris apartment as the doctor was examining Jim's body. Pamela said she and Jim had been snorting heroin for 2 days. Pam said they snorted heroin the night before and again that afternoon, after Jim had taken his walk with Ronay and before he went out to dinner alone. When they returned home from the movie and the bistro, the heroin came out again. Ronay quoted Varda as asking, "Who had the heroin? Was it you?" Pamela said, "Of course." In interviews Varda and Ronay gave to Paris Match magazine in 1991, both he and Varda said that when they arrived, they saw firemen on the street. Ronay asked, "Is he okay?" and was told to ask his questions upstairs. Ronay and Varda went up to the second-floor apartment. Now, there is a contradiction in the Ronay and Varda stories at this point. Varda remembers clearly that when they arrived, Jim was still in the tub, surrounded by members of the fire brigade. On the other hand, Ronay says that Jim was already on the bed, and that he never saw the body. Varda's accurate description of the death scene in the bathroom gives credence to her story over Ronay's. So bottom line, what really happened in Paris on July 3rd, 1971? I am certain that Jim died of an overdose of heroin, complicated by the alcohol level in his bloodstream. What generally happens when these two drugs come together and deliver their synergistic hammer blow is described as a massive pulmonary oedema, a kind of mega heart attack where the victim, poisoned by the combination, slumps forth spilling from his mouth and nostrils. Of course, no one will ever know. The only person present at the time of Jim's death was Pamela, who may not even have known herself what happened, and if she did, she took the full story to her grave. Obviously, she had something to do with Jim's death. She may have even unwittingly caused it, at least in her own mind, by having the heroin in the apartment and sharing it with him. End quote. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life Death Legend by Stephen Davis, where he discusses Jim Morrison's final days in Paris. Quote, "She was known among a certain louche element of the Parisienne jeunesse dorée as Pamela Morrison, wife of the famous American rock star. With her cool California beauty, fashion-forward wardrobe, long straight hair, paid-up credit cards, and ready laugh, Pamela was now a familiar figure in upscale Saint-Germain hangouts like Café de Fleur, Les Deux Magots, et Brasserie Lippe, as a companion of the young, well-connected Count Jean de Breteuil. Through Jean, Pamela had become friends with the gamine model and starlet Elisabeth Larivière, known professionally as Zozo. Zozo lived in a large apartment on the right bank, and when Pam learned that Zozo had a job coming up in the south, she arranged for Jim to rent the flat while Zozo was away that spring. Sometime in the middle of March 1971, Jim moved into the second largest bedroom of a fourth-floor apartment in a handsome 19th century Beaux-Arts building at 17 Rue Bois-Trellis in the 4th arrondissement. The large, slightly shabby flat was furnished with the typically overstuffed antiques of the bourgeoisie. There were elegant marble fireplaces, parquet floors, plaster reliefs on the walls, and the ceiling of the salon was painted with the blue sky and puffy clouds. The leaky bathroom, smelling of old-fashioned French plumbing, had a bidet, a toilet, and a narrow tiled wall tube that was equipped with a handheld shower. Zozo had padlocked her bedroom while she was away. Jim's room faced the morning sun, and he moved a leather-covered writing table by the big window. As the day progressed, he would move the table to the other side of the flat so he could sit in the sun as it warmed the courtyard in the rear of the building. A concert pianist lived across the courtyard, and the sound of her daily exercises seemed to please Jim. On the apartment's lobby mailbox, he taped a handwritten label for the postman, James Douglas, one of his incognito names. Judging from the entries in surviving notebooks, Jim began to explore Paris immediately. He visited his friend Agnes Varda at her apartment at 84 Rue Daguerre. Jim played with her daughter Rosalie a bit. Mostly, he just sat with Agnes and a few of her friends in her garden. Varda later told German journalist Rainer Modermann, quote, "Jim didn't say a superfluous word. He didn't like gossip. We used to meet relatively often, but I cannot say we ever talked much. We respected him. His greatest wish when he came to Paris was to remain here incognito, as someone who just wanted to write his poems." End quote. Jim also told Varda that he had both his films with him, and that he wanted to set up some screenings for them in Paris. Varda told Jim this might take some time in the present anti-American political climate in France, but that she would see what she could do. Pamela later told Jim that she didn't like Varda. Jim replied that if anything ever went wrong, Varda would be the only person in Paris that Pamela could completely trust. At first, Jim made notes on his wanderings through the Marais, the old quarter of Paris in which he lived. During the Renaissance, it had been the most elegant part of Paris, but had since become a funky and bohemian neighborhood dotted by stupendous landmarks of its past grandeur. Jim was drawn to the busy cafes around the Place de la Bastille. A Parisian friend of Pamela's, Victor Lamy, who would sometimes walk with Jim, recalls that he would emerge from his building in the early afternoon and walk to the boulevard to buy the International Herald Tribune. Then he liked to walk back up the Rue Beautreillis, past the repertory Théâtre Espace Marais, where Beaumarchais' Le Mariage de Figaro was playing, and continue past the large and cheerful elementary school L'École Massillon until he reached the Seine. His favorite route took Jim across the Pont Marie and along the Île Saint-Louis, the exclusive island in the middle of the river. Spring had arrived early in Paris that year, and on sunny days, Jim would often sit at one of the outside tables of the brasserie at the head of the Rue Saint-Louis en Île and drink a beer or two, either Stella Artois or Kronenberg. Refreshed, Jim pressed on across the footbridge to the Ile de la Cité, where he sometimes paused to light a candle in one of the quiet chapels of the Notre Dame Cathedral. Victor Lemy remembers that Jim was very attentive to the street musicians. There was music everywhere in Paris. American kids strumming guitars in the Place Saint-Michel, European kids bowing violins, English and Irish buskers, gypsies playing accordions in the metro. Jim usually emptied his pockets for these scruffy musicians, Lemmy said, and he stopped to listen to almost everyone he saw. And he gave each one a few francs or a large roll of bills if that was all he had with him. Another thing was that he wasn't recognized. He had this freedom, a different thing for him. He wore a suede jacket, a nice dress shirt, corduroy trousers. He looked like any postgraduate American 27-year-old student at the Sorbonne. Jim then crossed to the left bank. Sometimes he kept walking along the river, browsing in the bookstalls. Other times he wandered through the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, and paused amid the many bookshops. Paris was still in the grip of the revolutionary events of 1968, and Jim often stopped to watch, with total fascination, student demonstrations turn into mini riots in the streets. The government was paving over much of the Latin Quarter because the demonstrators of '68 had ripped up the city's classic old cobblestones and thrown them at the riot police. In 1971, Jim Morrison saw the last of the old Paris streets before they were lost forever. Sometimes Jim Morrison stopped for a drink at Pamela's hangout, the Café de Flore, erstwhile haunt of existentialist heroes Sartre and de Beauvoir, and sometimes at the Deux Moigots, where Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald contemplated the facade of the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the oldest church in Paris. Jim always had a spiral notebook or a bound journal with him and often seemed lost in their pages. Several times that spring, Jim was recognized and photographed, once smoking a cigar by young American tourists. Jim then usually recrossed the Seine on the Pont des Arts, caught the number 1 metro at the Louvre, got out at the St. Paul station, and walked home along the Rue Saint-Antoine, sometimes shopping for a bottle of whiskey, a bag of fresh strawberries, or a 10-cent fresh baguette. When the weather was fine and he didn't feel like walking, Jim often hung out at the exquisite Place des Vosges 2 blocks from his room. This 17th century square of red brick mansions was usually full of children and their nursemaids, and Jim liked to sit for hours and write or just watch the children playing in the sandboxes. It was one of the most historic places in France, the site of medieval jousts, royal palaces, and Renaissance military parades. Victor Hugo's house was in one corner of the square at number 6. Number 8 had been the home of Théophile Gautier. When Jim woke up, or came to, he often had coffee and croissant by the square. He told many of the people he met that spring, including Philippe Dalecki, that the Place des Vosges was his favorite spot in Paris. Philippe Dalecki was Zozo's boyfriend. He was tall, sympathetic, about 20. He spoke good English, played guitar, and was recovering from a near-fatal motorcycle crash. Jim took a liking to him immediately. When Zozo was in Paris, Philip and Jim hung out together at number 17. He was very, very quiet, and so you wanted to be quiet around him, Philip says. You almost had the feeling like he was recovering from something, trying to get his strength again. His mannerisms, his way of walking were very slow, almost effeminate in a way. I didn't really know who he was, so it was very relaxed between us. We went out with the girls a few times to restaurants in the quarter or to a bar in the Marais or Les Halles. Jim and Pamela did not speak French, and both were shy in public, so they sort of stuck close together. But there was always a good feeling between us, and I really liked him a lot. One day, Philip and Zozo came by the apartment to drop off her luxurious fur coat in the closet of her locked bedroom. They found the atmosphere very tense, as if Jim and Pam had been arguing. Zozo and Pam spoke for a few moments while Philip sat with Jim. On the way downstairs, Zozo whispered, "Pamela just came in from having sex with another person." Philip asked how she knew. "She told me," girl to girl. One afternoon in early April, Jim was drinking on the terrace of Las Roques, a bistro on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. He heard some American voices at the next table and started a conversation. Jim said he had language difficulties in Paris, and the isolation of this was beginning to get to him. It was nice to hear some familiar voices. The Americans turned out to be members of Clinic, an American band trying to get a break in Europe. The leader, Phil Traynor, finally asked if he was Jim Morrison. Jim nodded yes. They said they hadn't known Jim was in Paris. "Nobody knows," Jim said. Out came the guitars, and they jammed on blues songs for an hour or so. Jim was chain-smoking Marlboros and was coughing and spitting constantly. They all ended up drinking wine and whiskey at the apartment of someone Pamela knew. Jim smoked heavily, kept coughing, and got so loaded they had to put him in a taxi. It took 5 minutes for Jim to remember the address. Jim had cut down on alcohol when he first arrived in France, but after a month he started again. And the heavy, compulsive smoking began to take its toll. When Jim coughed up blood in April, Pamela told him to see a doctor at the American hospital in Neuilly. A physician exam and a lung x-ray turned up nothing obvious, and Jim was told to get some rest in a warm climate if possible. Jim and Pamela thought of the Côte d'Azur, where the Rolling Stones had just established themselves in their tax-related exile. But Jim wanted to see Spain and more of Morocco, so they left Paris in a rented car on April 10th and headed south into the lush and wet European spring. Jim Morrison drove their rented Peugeot sedan at a relaxed pace southwards toward Lyon and then headed for Spain. They picked up a few girl hitchhikers as they drove through southwest France, stopping for a night in Toulouse. The gray weather turned to sunshine after they crossed the Pyrenees and progressed through Catalonia. They both used the Super 8 movie camera, and a sequence shot at Madrid's Prado Museum shows Jim staring impassively at Hieronymus Bosch's immense The Garden of Earthly Delights, which Jim had written about in college, with hundreds of figures seething in various degrees of torment. Jim sat in front of the painting for an hour, completely transfixed. They then drove on to Andalusia, a pilgrimage Jim had wanted to make for years. In Granada, they visited the Alhambra, the great Moorish palace whose gardens, architecture, and vistas were one of the wonders of the world. Jim was so taken with the poetry of the site that he insisted on visiting for several days in a row. Pamela shot film of him sitting by the great fountain guarded by stone lions. Jim stood up, a beatific smile on his features, and walked towards the camera with his arms stretched wide, until only one Morrison eye filled the last frame of the sequence. They abandoned the car once they learned their insurance was no good once they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. In Tangier, they stayed at both the Hotel Minze and at the palatial home of Paul and Talitha Getty. Paul was the eldest son of the founder of Getty Oil. Talitha was a lovely Dutch actress. She was a good friend of the notorious Jean de Breteuil and one of his clients as well, sharing her husband's taste for heroin. Talitha Getty would die of a heroin overdose in Rome later that year. While shopping in the European section of the old port town, Jim bought a copy of Paul Boyle's novel The Sheltering Sky at the Librairie de Cologne on Avenue Pasteur. Jim and Pamela flew on to Marrakech, the ancient red-walled desert cavern terminus, where the Comtesse de Breteuil, Jean's mother and the grande dame of expatriate society, lived in a splendor at the Villa Taylor, one of the great estates in the old palm oasis outside the tumult of the old city. Jean was then living in Keith Richards' London house, but Madame de Breteuil had already met Pamela and warmly received her and her husband. They were given the top-floor bedroom of the villa's tower with surrounding views of the snow-capped peaks of the Atlas Mountains. The Countess told them that Winston Churchill had often stayed there when he came to Marrakech to paint after the war. One of the servants functioned as their guide, and they spent days exploring the souks of the ancient Medina. Jim loved the warren of sandy streets, dark alleys, and mud walls. The women were veiled, and the men wore djellabas with pointed hoods that gave them privacy. The sounds and smells were those of Africa, Jim noted in a journal that he left behind. In the evenings they often ate in the savory open-air restaurant of the Jama El Fna, the Square of the Dead. This was where the old salt caravans had stopped after crossing the Sahara, and it now served as a bus terminal and market. After dinner, they watched teams of acrobats and various bands of traditional musicians who competed for coins. Jim listened intently to the professional storytellers who drew huge crowds of country folk with their shouted tales of magicians and jinns. Surviving Super 8 footage shows Jim and Pamela in a horse-drawn carriage, in the evening being driven out to the Manara Oasis as the sun set over the mountains. Jim wanted to swim in the hot desert air, so they moved to the Hotel Marrakech, which had a pool. One afternoon, Pamela came down to the pool wearing a new white silk djellaba, one she had bought in the souk. She saw a cool-looking guy she thought she knew, talking to a couple of girls. Drawing closer, she saw it was Jim. He had shaved off his beard during the night. His hair was brushed back. He looked like himself again. Later, she told friends in California that at that shining moment, she immediately fell in love with Jim all over again. Their trip lasted around 3 weeks. On May 3rd, 1971, Jim and Pam flew from Marrakech to Casablanca and then on to Paris. When they got to their apartment, Zozo and some friends were in temporary residence, so Jim and Pam checked into L'Hôtel, an exclusive small hotel in the Rue des Beaux-Arts. L'Hôtel was famous for its discretion, and many celebrities felt comfortable there. It was also famous because Oscar Wilde had died in one of its rooms. His famous last words, "Either that wallpaper goes, or I do." Pamela had a huge problem now because Count de Breteuil was in London and she wanted heroin. Jim told a friend of Zozo's that he didn't want Pam scoring on the street. And anyway, he supposedly said, "Scoring is a man's job." Around that time, a Paris match photographer saw a friend sitting with Jim at the Café de Fleur and said hello. A few minutes later, the friend came over to his table, explained that Jim Morrison wanted some heroin, and did he know where they could find some. The upscale junk-using denizens of Paris usually ended up at the Rock and Roll Circus, very late at night. The circus was a big discotheque on the Rue de Seine, modeled on the American electric ballrooms of the 60s. The walls were decorated with large murals of English rock stars and Jimi Hendrix dressed as clowns. The club was famous for Led Zeppelin having jammed there 2 years earlier, but now a somewhat sleazy reputation for the drug and sexual commerce in the dark downstairs bathrooms. Yet, it was often packed with French movie stars, and the new Chinese heroin, China White, was sold openly in the club's dark corners. If Jim was getting heroin for Pamela, he was not to be outdone in the self-destruction sweepstakes. He was drinking heavily to match her heroin stupor, and began to act out while they were still living at L'Hôtel. One rainy morning at dawn, he opened the tall window of their second-floor room to let in some air, and then stood up on the iron railing just outside. As Pam looked on, Jim either jumped or lost his balance and fell out the window. There was a loud thump. Pamela ran to the window and saw Jim sprawled on the roof of a parked car. When she got to the street, he was already whipping the muck off his suede jacket. She tried to get him to come up to bed so she could call a doctor, but Jim said he'd see her later and ran off to look for a drink. They were at L'Hôtel for a couple of weeks and then moved back to the Rue Beautreillis. Alain René, Jim's old friend from UCLA, arrived in Paris sometime in May and started hanging out. René spoke the language and could get things done. He helped Jim carry firewood up the 4 flights from the lobby because Jim thought the building's heat was inadequate and said he was cold unless he sat by the fire. Pamela was stoned and in a trance most of the time. Jim seemed angry and frustrated that she wasn't really living with him and was quite content with her own independent life and friends. As the days got warmer, Jim walked to the Place des Vosges almost every afternoon, sat in the dark shade of the plane trees near the sandbox, and wrote in his spiral notebooks. One day, he opened the Herald Tribune and read the obituary of Warhol's ex-muse, Eddie Sedgwick, who had died in California of an overdose of barbiturates. In May 1971, Gilles Yepremian was an 18-year-old rock musician fan who occasionally hung out with his friends at the Rock and Roll Circus in Paris in hopes of seeking some of his heroes. One late night, May 8th, 71, he was checking out the original French rock star, Johnny Hallyday, as Johnny and his entourage got increasingly rowdy in the club's restaurant. As Johnny got louder and more annoying, the club's tough bouncers started hovering nearby. Suddenly, Gilles saw what he describes as a shadow leaping over his left shoulder. This turned out to be Jim Morrison, who was electing to leave the crowded club by trampling over tables and across the laps of other customers. Drinks were knocked over in the dark, candles were upset, people were shouting. They wanted to throw Hallyday out of the Rock and Roll Circus, Gilles recalls. But they couldn't because this guy was a national icon. It was much easier to throw Jim out instead because they had no idea who he was. He looked like an American student passing through Europe in an old green army jacket, blue jeans, and boots. The bouncers tossed an extremely drunk Jim into the club's outdoor vestibule. Gilles Yepremian had recognized Jim and followed them outside. Jim tried to get back in, but a bouncer barred his way and Jim fell down. Jim began bothering other customers as they tried to step over him. Jim then started kicking the glass doors with his boots, and it looked like the bouncers were going to sort him out. Yepremian had the good sense to intervene. I asked him, "Jim, are you Jim?" He looked away and said, "Yeah." And I said, okay, let's go. Come with me." Gilles got Jim upright and dragged him to a taxi idling outside on the Rue de Seine. Gilles asked Jim where he wanted to go, but Jim had passed out. The only place Gilles could think of to stash a comatose American rock star was the flat of his friend Hervé Muller, a well-known Parisian rock critic who was also France's premier Dylanologist. Gilles gave the driver Hervé's address, number 6 Place Tristan Bernard, and the taxi set off. As the sun was about to rise over Paris, Jim woke up while they were crossing the Pont de la Concorde over the Seine. "Stop the car," Jim shouted and jumped out. Gilles paid the driver and asked him to wait. Jim hopped onto the parapet of the bridge and began shouting. Gilles was afraid he was going to jump into the river. This also attracted the attention of 2 patrolling Paris cops, who stopped to see what was going on. "Jim," Gilles whispered. "Take care. Police are coming." Jim shouted and cursed. Gilles got Jim back into the taxi, but the driver was hesitant until Jim threw a huge wad of francs into the front seat. The driver became even more nervous and gave back the money. When they arrived at Hervé's building, Jim was shouting again. Begging him to be quiet, it was 5 a.m, Gilles started helping Jim up the 6 flights of stairs to Muller's flat. This took 40 minutes. Halfway up, as Gilles was prodding him along like a mountain guide, Jim turned to Gilles and stage whispered, "Shh, everyone's asleep." Finally, they knocked at the door. Inside, the young writer was asleep with his girlfriend, Yvonne Foucault, who eventually opened the door a crack. A Belgian girl, a house guest, thought the knock was a police bust and was busy throwing her stash out a rear window. Muller, who wrote for the main French music magazine Rock et Folk, was incredulous. Gilles recalls the following. "I said to Hervé, 'It's me, and I have Jim Morrison with me.' Hervé answered, 'F off, Gilles, it's 6 a.m. But he opened the door, and Jim Morrison, really gone now, brushed past Hervé until he reached his bedroom. Jim collapsed on Hervé's bed and immediately passed out. They tried moving him, but this proved impossible. Hervé and Yvonne spent the rest of the morning sleeping in sleeping bags in the living room. When Jim finally woke up that afternoon, he washed and got dressed, walked into the main room, and asked Hervé Muller, "Where am I?" Muller explained the situation. Jim shrugged, asked to borrow a hairbrush, and invited Hervé and Yvonne to breakfast at the Bar Alexandre. The food was superb, and Jim was in a good mood, discussing films and poetry and gently improving Hervé's command of California idiom. He talked about Pamela, saying they were just back from Morocco. He ordered a bottle of cognac, drank most of it out of his water glass, and soon got hellacious, bothering respectable people at nearby tables and throwing food. They normally didn't let hippies into the restaurant, but since Jim was already known for leaving obscenely large cash tips, the bistro staff left them alone. Hervé, not one to lose an opportunity, was taking photographs of the whole scene. After 2 hours, Jim staggered over to his favorite bench in front of the Alexandre and passed out. In late May of 1971, while Jim was living in Paris, the Doors office mailed him a copy of L.A. Woman, and Jim listened to it repeatedly. Ray Manzarek said that John Densmore then called Jim because the Doors were getting and turning down increasingly lucrative tour offers, since no one yet knew Jim had split. Gilles Yepremian said that when Jim got the Doors record, he did muse out loud about rejoining the band, but from the way he said it, Gilles could tell Jim didn't mean it. Doors manager Bill Siddons said he talked with Jim on 3 separate occasions. He said that Jim always seemed in good shape and sounded happy. Siddons told writer Patricia Butler, "We talked to him about coming back and all we ever got was, no plans, I'm having a great time. Maybe someday we'll do another record, but no plans." Jim was also in touch with accountant Bob Green when his money ran low. He sent touristic postcards, "The women are great and food is gorgeous," to the office and wrote letters to Michael McClure and a girlfriend in San Diego. He and Pamela took a day trip to the Château de Courson, an old country mansion southwest of Paris famous for its gardens. Sometime during these days, Jim wrote 2 drafts of As I Look Back, a nostalgic poem that would remain unpublished for 20 years. His friend Alain Ronet remembered that in Paris, Jim often spoke about his parents with affection, telling funny stories about his family. Before he had left Los Angeles, Jim had heard through old Navy family channels that his mother was concerned for his health. In Paris, according to Ronet, Jim asked Pamela to call his parents in Washington to assure his mother that reports of his poor health were exaggerated. One day, Jim and Pamela came to lunch at Hervé's flat with Jim's new friends, Hervé and Yvonne, Gilles Yepremian, and another music journalist, Henri-Jean Hainaut. Pamela was mistrustful and didn't speak, preferring to hide behind Jim's shoulder. They opened a bottle of Corsican wine, but Jim hardly touched his. Hervé was surprised Jim didn't get drunk. Instead, Jim thanked Hervé for helping him when he was drunk and gave Muller a signed copy of his privately printed An American Prayer. Gilles Yepremian recalls the following. Jim was very friendly, but it wasn't possible to discuss the Doors with him. If we mentioned the music, he just turned off completely. End quote. Hervé says that Jim did say he felt too old to be a rock star at the age of 27. Jim mentioned that they were planning to drive to Switzerland, but Yvonne suggested they go to Corsica instead. because the wine they were drinking was so delicious and the weather would be warm. Pamela turned and asked, "Oh, Jim, can we go there?" He laughed and said, "Sure, babe, we'll go next week." After the meal, they sat down to listen to music. Jim was shown Hervé's vast record collection and asked to choose. Gilles said that for the rest of the afternoon, Jim spun all of Hervé's Buffy Sainte-Marie albums. On May 18th, Jim and Pam flew to Marseille on their way to Corsica. At the airport, Jim's shoulder bag was stolen. Gone were his wallet, passport, plane tickets, and several notebooks. They flew back to Paris, where Jim got new papers, then on to Corsica, where it rained for 10 days and they were bored. Footage from the trip features Jim and Pam wandering unhappily through a gloomy graveyard under lowering, ominous skies. One long evening early in June 1971, Jim and his friend Alain Ronet were standing on the top step of the long staircase leading up to Sacré-Cœur, the great white church at the summit of Montmartre in northern Paris. A band of black African musicians were banging away, and Jim stopped to listen a while. Gazing off to the east, Jim asked Ronet about the large green hill he could see. Ronet explained that it was Père Lachaise, Paris's great cemetery. It dated from Napoleon's time and was where honored citizens like Chopin, Balzac, and Edith Piaf were buried. Jim insisted they visit immediately, but their taxi took an hour to fight through heavy traffic, and the gates were shut by the time they arrived. Jim and Elaine returned to the cemetery a few days later. They walked among the impressive monuments of the great artists and the florid 19th century tombs of the stolid bourgeoisie. When Ronet said he found the place a morbid experience, Jim protested that he liked the cemetery's spooky tranquility in the midst of the city, and that he definitely wanted to be buried in Père Lachaise when he died. On June 11, 1971, Jim went to see a play. Hervé Muller had gotten press tickets for American director Robert Wilson's Le Regard de Sourd, English title Deaf Man Glance, at the Théâtre de la Musique. Pamela didn't want to go, so Alain Ronet used her ticket. It was a colorful avant-garde production performed in French, enlivened by Wilson's bold staging that combined elements of architecture and painting. Wilson later famously collaborated with composer Philip Glass on the opera Einstein on the Beach. But the pacing was very slow and Jim became bored and thirsty and wanted to leave after the first act. Ronet persuaded Jim to stay, and later Jim seemed fascinated by the final tableau of naked actors pretending to be dead, surrounding the assassinated revolutionary Marat, who had been stabbed to death while laying in his bed. After the play, they went to a cafe for drinks. Jim thanked Hervé Muller for the evening. It was the last time Hervé saw Jim Morrison. The last notebook Jim Morrison worked on is now in a private collection in Paris. He had obviously started the spiral-bound steno pad before he left LA, since the first entry is Cohenga Auto 4663268. The first 20 pages of the notebook are full of stanzas and imagery written in Jim's large-lettered handwriting. There are almost no crossouts, as if the notebook represented a confident and finished sequence of poems. Several pages are variants of older poems, such as The Ancient Ones, Winter Photography, and The Hitchhiker. Other pages contain only 1 or 2 lines, but variations in the writing style indicate they may have been thought over for days. The notebook contains both wonderful new poems and scabrous jottings. The lyrics for a new song, Now You Are in Danger, go as follows. Let the piper call the tune, March, April, May, June. The next page continues short lyrics for a blues song. We're two of a kind, we're two of a kind, you want years and I want mine. Page 17 of the notebook contains 1 line, She'll get over it. This notebook was in Jim's plastic bag along with 2 tape boxes, Jim's photo file, and some random papers when Jim ran into Philip Dalecki in the street. Jim thought he had recorded something interesting in Orange County Suite, but couldn't listen to the tape reel because he only had a cassette player at home. Philippe Dalecki, an acquaintance of Jim's in France, recalls the following. I remember that I was walking along Rue de Rivoli when I ran into Jim. We had a drink together in a bar, and he said he needed to make a cassette from a reel-to-reel tape he had in his bag. I said I could help him and went over to my place, 5 Rue Chagrin, near the Place de l'Étoile, about a 5-minute walk from the bar. I had a little home studio with a Revox tape recorder and a K7 cassette deck, so I did the job. We had another drink, then Jim quickly left with the cassette, like he was really excited to listen to it. I went back to the studio and noticed Jim's plastic sack on the floor. I ran to the window, but he was already halfway down the block. I shouted, Hey Jim, you forgot this. He looked back at me over his shoulder and shouted, All right, keep it. See you later. Bye. Philippe put the bag in a drawer. The next day, he went to Saint-Tropez in the south of France with Zozo, who had a film job. He never saw Jim Morrison again. On June 29, 1971, a few days before Jim Morrison's death, Jim Morrison's secretary Robin Wardle was working with him. She was trying to reach someone at the Cinémathèque to discuss Jim's films. which now included a recently received print of Granada TV's agitprop documentary, The Doors Are Open. But no one was interested. The Doors had never played in France because the second European tour had been cancelled during Jim's trial in Miami. Outside of a few thousand fans of American rock, Jim Morrison was unknown in his palace of exile. Jim also dictated a letter to the Doors' accountant, Bob Green, which was typed undated by Robin Wardle and mailed on June 28, 1971. In it, Jim was adamant about cutting ties to his former life, saying that, quote, Paris is beautiful in the sun, an exciting town built for human beings, end quote, and asking if it would be possible to stay here indefinitely. He also asked Green to send a financial statement and a copy of the Doors' partnership agreement, and informed him that he and Pamela had decided to turn over Themis to Pamela's sister and her husband so that they could eventually be completely clear of any involvement. Themis, of course, being Pamela Corson's clothing store, which Jim Morrison helped finance. In conclusion, Jim Morrison wrote the following. Any luck on the credit cards? We could use them made out to both our names. What's the problem? And if you'd send our check when you receive this, house bills are catching up. Please send $3,000, about $25,000 in current money. Give our best to all. Later, Jim. According to highly unreliable accounts, something very bad apparently happened to Jim Morrison on one of the last nights in June. One of Jim Morrison's friends in Paris, Hervé Muller, whose life was later threatened when he conducted his own investigation into Jim's last days, found people in the heroin underworld who swore that Jim had bought some smack from a Chinese dealer called Le Chinois, and a local kid known as Petit Robert, in the basement bathroom of the Rock and Roll Circus Club in Paris. They claim that Jim has snorted a big load, passed out, and turned blue. Someone murmured, Il est mort. He is dead. The people he was with, two guys, carried Jim out of the bathroom through the kitchen the circus shared with the adjacent Alcazar nightclub and out of the Alcazar's entrance on the Rue Mazarin. They bundled Jim into a cab, got him upstairs on the Rue Beautreillis where Jim's apartment was, threw him into the bathtub, and split. Somehow, Jim came through it and recovered. This unverifiable but often repeated story that Jim Morrison had OD'd at the Rock and Roll Circus became part of the local drug lore and will forever cast doubt on what really happened to Jim 2 nights later. No one still alive can say with complete confidence what took place in the 4th floor at 17 Rue Beautreillis on the morning of July 3rd, 1971. Only 2 people could have. Pamela Corson and Jean de Breteuil, who were fully party to the tragic death of Jim Morrison, but both died soon after. It is, however, accurate to say that in the frenzied days immediately following July 3rd, an improvised, risky, remarkably skillful, and cynical cover-up abetted by the detrimentally lax procedures of the local authorities enabled an American rock star's sordid and potentially scandalous heroin overdose with obvious but messy criminal implications and enormous financial consequences to be officially decreed a common heart attack by the city of Paris. Pamela Corson told several versions of her story. One to the police, one to friends Alan Ronay and Agnes Varda, and others to friends in California over the next 3 years. Jean de Breteuil blurted out his story in Morocco, where he felt safe 3 days after the events. Jim Morrison's friend in Paris, Hervé Muller, published findings that indicated Jim had really died in the bathroom of the circus club a day or so earlier. Taking all these sometimes dubious, thinly sourced narratives into account, one can construct a speculative timeline that considers all the variants of the painful, heartbreaking final hours of Jim Morrison's life. Pamela Corson said they did go to the movie. On a bright and warm summer's night, they walked through the village Saint-Paul, past the crumbling old city wall, down the narrow passage Charlemagne, and found a cab at the Saint-Paul taxi stand. The film, Pursued, was director Raoul Walsh's attempt to inject a film noir sensibility into the standard Hollywood Western format. It was playing, ironically, in an art house near the Pelletier Metro. After the movie, they ate some sweet and sour Chinese food at one of the late-night restaurants on the Rue Saint-Antoine. Jim washed his food down with several beers. At 1 o'clock, they called it a night and went back to their flat. Jim was restless. He was sipping whiskey out of the bottle, possibly in pain from his various injuries and ailments. He sat at his desk with an open notepad, but couldn't focus. Pamela was cutting lines of heroin on a mirror with a credit card. They both began snorting the drug using rolled-up money. Jim started threading Super 8 films of their travels into the projector. Pamela said they sang together as they watched their dark, jerky, out-of-focus movies of Spain, Morocco, and Corsica on the wall. Jim, according to Pamela in all her narratives, played old Doors records, even The End, far into the night. Between reels, they broke for lines of the strong Chinese drug. If the neighbors can be believed, early that morning, Jim Morrison became very upset. Raging, he opened the apartment's door and went into the hall before someone dragged him back in and slammed the door. A year later, the woman who lived directly upstairs told Philippe and Zozo that on the night her friend had died, she had been awakened by a disturbance. She had opened her door with the chain on and had looked out to see Monsieur Douglas, aka Jim Morrison, naked and screaming on the staircase. According to Pamela, Jim started coughing again and had trouble clearing his throat. Pamela eventually told Jim they should go to bed. It was 3 o'clock on Saturday morning. Jim asked Pamela for another line or two before bed. It was her stuff bought from Jean, and at home she was the one who handled it, although she also maintained that Jim had his own stash as well. Jim was still awake when Pamela nodded off in a heroin stupor. She woke up maybe an hour later. It was 4 o'clock in the morning and very dark. Jim, lying next to her, was gurgling horribly. It sounded like he was drowning in his own mucus. But she had heard this before and tried to wake him up. She couldn't rouse him. She slapped his face, nothing. She hit him hard again and again until he began to come to. An awful scene now ensued. Rousing himself in obvious pain, Jim staggered to the bathroom. Someone, Pamela couldn't remember who, turned on the water in the tub, and Jim lowered himself in. Pamela went back to bed and passed out again. She awoke in a cold sweat to terrible retching sounds. Jim Morrison, still in the bath, was now vomiting up chunks of pineapple and vivid clots of blood. Pamela rushed into the kitchen, fetched an orange Le Creuset saucepan, and ran back into the bathroom. Jim vomited some more into the saucepan. When the nausea passed, she flushed the stuff down the toilet. She later said she thought she had to empty and wash out the basin 3 times. She said that Jim now told her he felt better and to go back to sleep. Sometime around 5 o'clock, as the sky was turning light, Pamela Corson, overcome with heroin fatigue, fell back into bed. As she was drifting off, she thought she heard Jim calling out to her, "Pamela, are you there?" Perhaps an hour later, Pamela woke up again. Jim hadn't come back to bed. Morning light filtered through the covers of the windows. She got up and went to the bathroom. The door was locked from the inside. She shouted at Jim, rattled the heavy door, but there was no response. At 6:30 on Saturday morning, Pamela called Jean Le Breteuil, who was in bed with Marianne Faithfull. Marianne was stoned but remembered when the call came in. "I gotta go, baby," Jean said. That was Pamela Morrison. That woke Marianne up. "Jean, listen to me. I've got to meet Jim Morrison." "Not possible, baby. Not cool right now, okay? Je t'explique later. I'm right back." He was at the flat within half an hour. Pamela, dressed in her white silk jalaba, was out of her mind and incoherent. Jean calmed her down, broke a glass pane in the bathroom door, turned the lock, and let himself in. They found Jim Morrison dead, still in the bathtub. Blood was still drying under his nose and mouth, as if he had violently hemorrhaged. There were 2 large and lividly purple bruises on his chest. The bath water was dark pink, as if Jim bled out until his heart stopped. Pamela later said that he looked relaxed for the first time in months, his head turned slightly to his left, a slight smile on his lips. He had such a serene expression, Pamela said later, if it hadn't been for all that blood. Pamela started slapping Jim, talking to him, freaking out. Then she got halfway into the tub with Jim before Jean pulled her away and dragged her out of the bathroom. With cool calculation, amid terror and considerable anguish, Jean told Pamela that he was leaving town. Janis Joplin, who had OD'd on the heroin that Jean sold her, was one thing. Jim Morrison was another. The Paris police had already opened a dossier on his drug-dealing activities. Jean told Pamela that now they all had to get out of Paris as soon as possible. He and Marianne would leave for Morocco that night. Jean told Pamela that if she could get to Morocco, where his family had great influence, he would be able to protect her, if any legal questions arose. Jim had no track marks on his body. Autopsies were only performed in France on suspicion of murder. Jean told Pamela that police would soon be in the house and to flush any drugs she had. She could tell the medical examiner that Jim had heart disease. Pamela asked Jean what to do next. "Call your other friends," Jean said. "Get them to help you. I will see you again before I leave. I'm sorry, darling. I love you. Goodbye." Jean Le Breteuil left 17 Rue Beautreillis around 7:30 on Saturday morning. Pamela padded back into the bathroom to talk things over with Jim Morrison, who had died alone about 90 minutes earlier at the age of 27. No one knows for sure where Count de Breteuil went after he left Pamela alone with Jim Morrison's body soaking in the bathtub. After several hours, he arrived back at l'hotel where Marianne Faithfull was waiting. She said that he was stoned but also very agitated. He woke her and she asked what had happened. Jean then dragged her out of bed and beat her up. When he had finished, Marianne lit a cigarette. "Get packed," he growled. "We're going to Morocco. I want you to meet my mother." "But we just got here," Marianne replied. Jean didn't care. Marianne was getting the picture. They were blowing town fast. "What happened there?" she asked. Jean replied by saying, "Shut up." Marianne now got it. Marianne recalls the following. Jean was scared for his life. Jim Morrison had OD'd and he had provided the smack. Jean saw himself as a dealer to the stars. Now, he was just a small-time heroin dealer in big trouble. He was very young. Had he lived, he might have turned into a human being. There is one clue as to the Count's movements after he left Pamela. At an all-night disco called La Boule, on the Rue de la Montagne Saint-Geneviève, there was a weird announcement made over the sound system that morning by American DJ Cameron Watson. Sometime around 8 o'clock, after a word with a couple of dope dealers who had stopped by his booth, and with only a handful of customers left in the club, Watson stopped the music and said, "Jim Morrison died this morning." Then, he repeated the news in French. He was, mysteriously, the first person to announce Jim Morrison's death. Agnes Varda, Jim's close friend, had her phone ring at about 7:30 on Saturday morning. Partner and fellow friend of Jim Morrison's, Hélène Ronet, awoke and answered it, but the line was dead. It rang again a few moments later. Monique Godard, the yoga healer, was calling to say that she was leaving Paris that day, but during the night, she had a feeling that Ronet's American friend, Jim Morrison, who she was introduced to, had to see a doctor immediately. She said, "If your friend wants my help, he must see a doctor first. Does he take drugs? Does he have circulatory problems?" Ronet said he had contacted her to help Pamela, not Jim. In response, she said the following. "Her? I would never take her on, never. Listen, your friend must see a doctor immediately. I feel these things. It could even be too late." Ronet asked Godard if she had called a few minutes earlier, but she said no. Again told Ronet to take care of his friend and hung up. The phone immediately rang again. It was Pamela Corson, speaking very softly. Ronet told her to speak up, and then heard the fear in her voice. "Jim is unconscious, Hélène. He's bleeding. Can you call an ambulance for me? You know I can't speak French. Oh, please hurry. I think he may be dying." Pamela couldn't say anything else because she was sobbing. She hung up. Ronet dressed and crossed Varda's courtyard to wake her. She immediately called the Paris Fire Department's emergency line. The rescue squad was the best chance for anyone in a medical crisis in Paris to stay alive. She ordered Ronet to write down Jim's address for her and told him to write a note to Bertolucci and the maid that they were leaving in an emergency. She told Ronet to bring his American passport, because they would need it when the police arrived. Varda drove them in her old Volkswagen Beetle. They were delayed by a political demonstration on the Ile de la Cité. The students were leafletting the drivers, explaining their grievances. Ronet was almost pissing himself in fear. Weaving through traffic, Varda finally got them to Rue Beautreillis about 9:30 in the morning. Fire trucks, an ambulance, and a small crowd held back by a police officer were in front of number 17. When they got upstairs, Pamela was in the apartment's foyer, still dressed in her wet djellaba, surrounded by firemen. "My Jim is dead, Elaine," Pamela said. "I want to be alone now. Please leave me alone." Ronet was stunned. He glanced over at Jim's empty boots in the hallway, one in front of the other, as if he'd just stepped out of them. When the fire rescue squad had arrived a few minutes earlier, they had lifted Jim out of the bath and laid him out on the floor. They tried cardiac massage briefly, but the body was already cold. They had carried Jim to his bedroom and placed him on the bed. Pamela covered Jim with a blanket. Agnes Varda asked the fire chief if he was sure Jim was dead. With tender courtesy, the chief replied that the resident had been dead for at least an hour before they had arrived. Varda went into the bedroom to be with Pamela. A police inspector then arrived. When Varda came into the hallway, Ronet whispered to her not to let them know who Jim was or who she was either. "Don't exaggerate," Varda replied. "Believe me, they have no idea my films even exist." The inspector began to grill Ronet. "How did you know Mr. Douglas Morrison?" one of Jim Morrison's incognito names in France. After establishing that Ronet was an American citizen, he asked about Jim's age, nationality, and occupation. What about the girlfriend? Did they use drugs? He turned and asked the paramedics to write a full statement. Ronet then told them, My friend's name was Douglas Morrison. Douglas James Morrison, an American. He was a poet. He was an alcoholic, but no, he didn't use drugs. The inspector was skeptical. Looking around the flat, he remarked that poets don't usually live in such bourgeois surroundings. If he was really a poet, as you say, how could he afford some place like this? Ronay replied that Mr. Morrison lived on a private income, then pleaded that he was traumatized and couldn't answer questions. The inspector backed off a bit and said that if the medical examiner's report was satisfactory, the police would certify a death certificate and a burial permit. Otherwise, there would be an inquiry. Then he left. The bedroom door was closed. A hotel sign brought back from Morocco hung on the doorknob. It read, "Do not disturb" in French and Arabic. Suddenly, the door opened and all the firemen filed out and left the apartment. They were now alone. Ronay couldn't bring himself to go in. All he saw were Jim's bare feet hanging off the edge of the bed. Pamela came into the hall, still in her jalaba. Ronay told her he had reversed Jim's name for the police, and she said she had done the same thing. Agnes then came out and took them into the salon. "Tell us what happened," Ronay urged Pamela. "We won't be alone much longer." Pamela began to pick at the embroidered silk threads of the sleeves of the jalaba. They went to the movies, she said. They ate and came home. They sniffed heroin. Varda asked, "Who had it? You?" "Of course," Pam answered, almost proudly. "I'm the one who holds it." She turned to Ronay and said, "Hélène, why haven't you seen him yet? My Jim, man, he's so beautiful. You should check this out. Go see." Ronay ignored her. What happened next? Pamela told them about the films, the records, the coughing and breathing problems, and the crisis that led Jim to the bathtub. She left out the mad scene in the hallway, the bathroom door locked from the inside, and the involvement of Jean de Breteuil. Both women began to weep. Agnes, overcome, took Pamela's hand. The telephone rang. Varda said something about the phone possibly being tapped. The caller was Jean de Breteuil. Ronay went out to buy cigarettes. The ambulance was still in front of the building. A few people were still gathered, gossiping about the young foreigner they had often seen walking through the corridor for the past several months, who had died in the night. There was still no idea of who he really was. But two long-haired young dudes in silk scarves and leather jackets were loitering as well, and they followed Elaine up the steps. They introduced themselves as Jean and Jean-Louis and asked to see Pam. When Ronay protested, Jean said, "Look, she called me, and I know everything." Varda appeared, ready to brook no nonsense. "I lived with Pam for 6 months," the Count blurted. "She wants to see me." Varda told him to get out, but Pamela emerged from the bedroom. She called the Count to the other bedroom. They sat on the bed and talked for a while. Ronay interrupted them. There would be a scandal if the Count was there when the medical examiner and the cops arrived. They had to get Jim buried before questions could be asked. As he was leaving, Jean told Ronay that both his London digs and his Moroccan homes were at Pamela's disposal. On his way out, the Count tripped over something that was under the carpet of the foyer. It was a hash pipe. Jean put it into his pocket and left with his friend. That evening, he and Marianne Faithfull took the night flight to Casablanca. Back at the flat, Pamela assured Ronay that all the dope had been flushed. She went into the bedroom carrying a pile of papers and copies of an American prayer and locked them in Jim's desk. Agnes said she wanted to leave before the medical examiner arrived and told Pamela that she could stay at her house. When Varda left, Pamela started to burn papers in the fireplace. Anything with Jim's name on it went up in smoke. She also burned some of her own letters, a journal, and files relating to Jim's various arrests in Los Angeles. Ronay said he thought the cops would smell the fire on what was turning out to be the hottest day of the summer and ask questions. Pamela didn't care. Some of her letters, she explained, were like diary entries about Jim and drugs. She then produced an application for a marriage license from Denver from 1967. She asked, "Will they accept this? Do they know English?" Ronay assured her that it wouldn't work. Next, Pamela broke into Zozo's padlocked bedroom with the fireplace hatchet and emerged wearing a full-length mink coat. "It's mine now," she told Ronay. "I'm taking it with me. She'll never give me back all the money we paid her in advance." Ronay said later that he convinced Pamela that she was in enough trouble already and she hung the fur coat back in the closet. The doorbell rang. It was the doctor, a short, stocky, middle-aged man carrying a black bag. "Where's the corpse?" he asked. Ronay pointed to the bedroom. Following legal procedure, the doctor demanded that Ronay accompany him to lay out the body. Ronay begged off because he didn't want to see Jim, but Pamela then appeared, apparently in a trance. Speaking in an artificial voice, she took the doctor's arm. "This is my very beautiful man, sir," she said, as she took him into the bedroom. The exam was completed in less than 5 minutes. The doctor came out and asked Ronay to translate Pamela's answers to his questions. He asked for Jim's age and was shocked when he was told he was 27. I was going to write 57, the doctor told Ronay. He asked if Jim ever used drugs and was told no, never. Ronay tried to tell him about the coughing spasms, but the doctor waved him off. All right, I understand, he said. He filled out a form and handed it to Ronay with an envelope. Take this to the civil registry of the 4th arrondissement, he said, and show it to the clerk. They will give you the death certificate. Then he offered his condolences to Pamela and left abruptly. It was now around noon. Ronay said that they then went to get something to eat. Then they went to get the death certificate. The office, though, was closed, so they came back later. The lone woman on duty on a sleepy Saturday afternoon scanned the papers and told them that their request for a death certificate due to natural causes would be denied. She made a phone call and handed the receiver to Elaine. The prefect of police angrily told Ronay to get back to number 17 within 10 minutes. The police arrived half an hour later. They found Pamela sitting demurely in the bedroom next to Jim's body. She was holding hands with Jim, talking to him quietly. The inspector, Captain Barry, was brisk and unsympathetic. Jim had been cleaned up with no traces of blood or any needle marks. The police quickly inspected the apartment and found nothing. The fresh ashes in the fire grate went unnoticed, but Captain Barry was bothered by the scene. He obviously smelled something very wrong and 20 years later told an interviewer that he thought Mr. Morrison had overdosed on drugs. He arranged for the senior medical examiner to arrive later to look at the corpse. Finally, he told Pamela that if the new doctor found nothing amiss, they would receive the death certificate and burial permit. Ronay asked when they could remove Jim's body. Captain Barry replied that they couldn't. It might have to be sent to the police morgue for analysis. The corpse will remain here until further instruction, he told Ronay. The only problem will be the heat of the next few days. Ronay protested that this would inflict great cruelty on Pamela, but the officer was unmoved. He said certain normal arrangements for this would be made, and that they now had to come with him to the Quartier de l'Arsenal police headquarters to make a statement. Pamela and Ronay sat in the back of the police sedan. Ronay whispered to Pamela to cry a lot and make it look good. In an office upstairs, a triplicate official form was rolled into the typewriter and Pamela began telling her story in English, which the inspector now told them he knew perfectly well. Pamela perked up a bit and spoke with some animation. She said that the movie they had seen was called Death Valley. She left out the heroine, Jim's outburst, and the count, so she blundered into several inconsistencies and mistakes. As police sirens sounded outside, Ronay was afraid she was telling too much and could get herself in trouble now. So, the inspector asked, disgusted, you abandoned him 3 times to empty the basin you said he vomited in? 3 times? And where did you empty and wash the basin? Pamela said the sink, which Ronay thought was the wrong answer. The inspector looked at her sharply. When she described her violent efforts to arouse Jim by hitting him in the face, Barry shook his head in obvious contempt. Turning to Ronay, he fired off questions in French. Let's get this finished. What was this girl to him? Ronay answered, she was practically his wife. The cop wrote concubine, the official word for unmarried spouse. Did they have sexual relations the night he died? Pamela answered no. Finished typing, Captain Barry told him to go back to the apartment to receive the new medical examiner. Once inside the flat, Pamela had a fit. She shouted at Ronay that she couldn't understand what was going on, that he had to make her understand what was being said. Ronay was scared for himself as well. It crossed his mind that if Jim had been murdered, he could be implicated in covering up the crime. He didn't yet know that Pamela was Jim's sole heir. It's possible also that Pamela didn't know either. Ronay, trying to control his emotions, told Pamela that she just had to trust him. Dr. Max Vasile arrived around 6 o'clock, carrying a black leather bag. Jim had been dead for 12 hours now. Vasile was an older gentleman, relaxed, and he smiled at them. He walked briskly into Jim's room and walked out again within a minute. He had a quick look at the bathtub. In the dining room, he told Pamela and Ronay that he thought it was strange that so young a man who seemed to be in good condition should just die in the bathtub like that. Ronay told Dr. Vasile about the heavy drinking and the violent coughing spells he had witnessed. Vasile stood up. He told him that if their statements were accurate, and could not be immediately proven otherwise, he was inclined to say that Mr. Morrison had died of a heart attack caused by blood clots in the cardiac artery. He was now going to the Arsenal station to file his report. He advised them to rest for an hour. You both look very tense, and then join him at the station. Vasile took Pamela's hand and offered his condolences. He took her wrist to feel her pulse and nodded that she seemed all right. After he left, and it looked for the first time that day that they might be in the clear with the authorities, Pamela fell apart and began to cry. Then, when her tears were dry, she had a tantrum. "Valium," she screamed at Ronay. "I want Valium. Give some to me now." Ronay said he'd flushed his pills down the toilet. Pamela started crashing around the apartment until she found a few that she had stashed herself. After she calmed down, Pamela said she wanted Jim cremated and his ashes scattered someplace he liked. Ronay said cremation was very rare in France, and that an autopsy was always required first. Ronay told Pamela about Père Lachaise and suggested they try to bury Jim there, near Chopin, Sarah Bernhardt, Molière, or Claude Debussy. This seemed reasonable to her. Pamela began going through the pockets of Jim's clothes, collecting about $200 in francs in a glass jar. She would need cash for the funeral. She would have to call one of the people she hated, Bill, the door's manager, Bob, the accountant, Max, the lawyer, and get some money out of them. And they all hated her, too. Ronay pointed out that the American banks were shut until Tuesday because of the 4th of July holiday. She decided to ask Bill Siddons to bring the money personally. Ronay suggested calling the Morrisons in Washington. "We don't have to worry about that," Pamela said coldly. While Pamela leafed through some old photos of Jim, Ronay then called Agnes Varda. When they went to the police station, they would have to reveal the true order of Jim's name. Someone might notice, and the story could leak out and cause an uproar. Varda had a press baron friend, whose wife Ronay had once escorted to a Doors concert in Los Angeles. Ronay says that Varda's connection worked for 4 straight days to keep Jim's death off the prefecture of the police's death toll, and any mention of a rock star in Paris suddenly dying out of the papers. Captain Barry received them coolly at the Arsenal station. At 7:30, he handed them the death certificate, backdated to 2:30 that afternoon, and the burial permit. He asked for Jim's passport, which had to be turned over to the American embassy. To avoid giving Jim's real name, Ronay lied that they had left it at the flat. Besides, the embassy would be closed until Tuesday because of the American Independence Day. The inspector said that they could return it themselves and that they were free to go. "What about the body?" Ronay asked. "Leave him where he is for now," Barry said, and picked up the phone. The doorbell rang at 8 o'clock, only a few moments after Pamela Corson and Elaine Ronay returned to the flat where Jim Morrison lay dead. Ronay was making tea, so Pamela answered the door. After a commotion, she shouted to Elaine, asking if he had ordered some ice cream. When he went to investigate, he found a small mortician in a dark suit carrying a plastic bag and 25 pounds of dry ice. The police inspector had sent him. Shown into Jim's room, he wrapped the corpse in the bag with the ice. On the way out, he gave his card to Ronay, told him that he would visit regularly until the funeral. "Believe me," he said, "I'll do my best. But this heat is against us." Ronay told him that Pam wanted to sleep next to the body. The mortician looked pained and said that he strongly advised against it. Ronay left also to get some badly needed rest. On that Sunday, July 4th, 1971, no one yet knew that Jim Morrison was dead. Pamela seemed better when Ronay returned late that morning. The Iceman had already been and gone. Pamela was exhausted, but told Ronay that having Jim in the house made her feel secure. She said that if they could do it, they would live like this forever. The Iceman came again late in the day. He repacked Jim and explained to Ronay that with the continuing heat wave Paris was enduring, the current situation would become impossible to sustain by Tuesday. That evening, Elaine Ronay spoke with a well-connected Paris lawyer who had been contacted by Agnes Varda in case there were problems with the police. The phone rang for the first time that night. Ronay thought it was someone from Elektra's London office. Pamela said Jim wasn't home and hung up. Word was getting out. A Radio Luxembourg disc jockey named Jean-Bernard Herbet had heard the mysterious announcement the other night at La Boule about Jim's death and mentioned it on his show, later on Sunday. A Paris party girl told her journalist friend that she had heard the disc jockey at La Boule announcing Jim's death, and she knew that Jim was in Paris. The journalist checked the wire services and found nothing. His editor told him to call the record company for a statement. In London, Elektra's executive Clive Selwyn was soon asked if Jim Morrison had died in Paris. Selwyn replied that he had no idea Jim was even in Paris. He called Elektra executives in Los Angeles. Someone got him Jim's phone number. There was no answer. Then, a woman finally picked up and said that Jim wasn't home. So he called Bill Siddons, the band manager. On Monday, after a second night spent lying next to her decomposing boyfriend, Pamela consented to a burial as soon as possible. Ronay walked across the river and found the house of Bigot, the undertaker, in the shadows of the twin spires of Notre Dame Cathedral, where the old monastic cloister had once stood. Mr. Guillard, the director, explained that everyone wanted to rest at Père Lachaise and there were very few spaces left. Ronay pleaded that Douglas Morrison, Jim Morrison's incognito name, had been a famous young American writer. Guillard brightened. "A writer? I know a space. In Division 89, very close to another famous writer, Mr. Oscar Wilde. Ronay was shocked. No, I beg you, not next to Oscar Wilde. Please, can you find another space? A small double plot was found near a memorial to victims of Nazi oppression in Paris in a less desirable location on the other side of the hill. The funeral was arranged for Wednesday morning, July the 7th. On Monday afternoon, the undertakers came to the flat, dressed Jim in a too large dark suit, and stuffed him into a too small wood veneer coffin. Pamela gathered all the pictures of herself that she had and placed them in the coffin. The coffin was then sealed tightly with screws to delay further decay in the hot, dark apartment. Pamela later said she had never seen Jim in a suit before. She said she thought he looked kinda cute. On Monday, July 5th, 2 days after Jim Morrison's death, the Doors manager Bill Siddons got a phone call in his Los Angeles home at 4:30 in the morning. Before he picked up, Cherry Siddons said, "Something's happened to Jim." It was Clive Selwyn, the Elektra Records executive in London, calling with the worst possible news. Siddons called Jim's Paris number, but no one answered. He tried again at 8 in the morning. This time, Pamela picked up. She sounded very nervous. Bill told her there were rumors that Jim had died. "No," she said, "that isn't true." Siddons then asked to speak with Jim, and Pamela began to sob. He told her he wanted to help her and booked a seat on the next plane to Paris. Then he called Ray Manzarek. Ray said they'd heard these types of rumors before, but Siddons said it seemed different this time. Ray said he couldn't believe it without some proof. Among the other Doors, no one was surprised, and there were not a lot of tears shed for Jim. Bill Siddons arrived at 17 Rue Beautreillis in Paris, Jim's apartment, at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. He found Pamela with Jim's secretary, Robin Wardle. They explained that Jim was in his coffin, which had been sealed for health reasons. Pamela was distraught and preoccupied with getting her things packed so she could go home. Jim Morrison's friend Ellen Ronay arrived and explained the situation, and they all agreed to keep the death and the funeral secret as long as they could. Robin took Pamela to the American Embassy to file a death report and return Jim's passport later in the day. Pamela was listed in the report as James Morrison's girlfriend. No one mentioned anything about Jim Morrison, because Jim was under the incognito names of Douglas or James Morrison in France, and they left quickly and hoped no one would notice. Sometime that day, Siddons opened a small, ornate Chinese box he found on a bureau in the apartment. He tasted the white powder it contained and later said he thought it was heroin. Pamela was listed as Jim's cousin on the burial certificate. Notarized on Wednesday morning. At 11 o'clock, a small procession wound its way up the cobblestones from the main gate of Père Lachaise, one of the most famous cemeteries in France. Jim was carried up the hill on a noisy, motorized cart, followed by several pallbearers, the undertaker, and his friends, Pamela, Ronay, Agnes Varda, Robin Wardle, and Bill Siddons. They stopped at grave number 5, second row, 6th division. The pallbearers laid the coffin by the grave. There was no priest, no religious observance. Pamela cleared her throat and said in a soft voice that Jim wanted a few lines recited when he died. From memory, she whispered the last lines of Jim's poem, Celebration of the Lizard. Now night arrives with her purple legion. Retire now to your tents and to your dreams. Tomorrow we enter the town of my birth. I want to be ready. The funeral lasted about 8 minutes. Then everyone left. No one lingered at the grave to witness the interment. A couple of elderly French widows tending to their late husbands' graves in the same division witnessed Jim Morrison's funeral. They said they thought the mourners had been in an unseemly hurry. They thought it was a shame to have a funeral without a priest. They walked over to the abandoned grave when the workmen had finished filling it in. They saw only a small square of freshly turned earth. There was no headstone, and there would be none for many years. One of the women brought over a faded plastic rose from a nearby grave and laid it on Jim Morrison's. Then there was nothing but the quiet, pretty summer day under the shady trees of the old cemetery. They all helped Pamela to pack her things, except Agnes Varda, who'd had quite enough. Jim Morrison's death inspired the critical scene in The Last Tango in Paris, filmed shortly afterward, in which Marlon Brando's character speaks to the laid-out corpse of his wife who has killed herself. It took 25 shipping boxes to get Pamela ready to travel, including a metal case containing Jim's manuscripts and notebooks. Even so, she would leave a lot behind. Bill Siddons was on the last plane to LA on Thursday night. When he arrived the next day, he drove to the Doors workshop and said, "Well, we buried Jim yesterday." Late that night, he called the band's publicists, Gary Stromberg and Bob Gibson. Their answering service found them getting drunk at Dan Tana's. They had to break into their own offices because neither had a key. They asked Robert Hilburn, the pop writer for the Los Angeles Times, to come over at 3 in the morning and then began working on a press release and a statement from the Doors about the death of Jim Morrison. Pamela Courson also flew home with sit-ins that night, having left her old man in the soil of Paris, along with a lot of unanswered questions. She was the sole heir to Jim Morrison's fortune, but first there would be hell to pay in California. The reporter from the Washington Post reached Admiral Steve Morrison at home in Arlington, Virginia. The reporter asked him for a comment on his son's death in Paris. There was silence. The Admiral said he hadn't heard anything about it. The reporter said he had just confirmed the story with the Doors manager, Bill Siddons. Admiral Morrison said that if Siddons said it happened, it probably was true. He then asked the reporter to call back with any further information. Admiral Morrison later called the naval attaché at the American Embassy in Paris to confirm the story. The Morrison family was said to be very broken up about Jim's death. About a month later, Jim's passport was returned to his parents, Steve and Clara Morrison. The man who supplied Pamela and Jim with the heroin that ended up killing Jim, Jean Le Breton, died himself of a heroin overdose later that year in 1971. Pamela Courson died of a heroin overdose in 1974. End quote. The Doors' legacy is one filled with many ups and downs. Despite the various tensions over the years, thankfully at present, the surviving members of the Doors, John Densmore and Robbie Krieger, seem to be on good terms, both with each other and with the overall history of the band. The following is a quote from John Densmore from 2020, where he talks about Jim Morrison. This quote is from his book, The Seekers. Quote, "I was jamming at Manzarek's garage when Ray handed me a crumpled piece of paper with Jim's lyrics to break on through. Day destroys the night, night divides the day. Tried to run, tried to hide, break on through to the other side." Not only were the lines rhythmic, which I as a drummer appreciated, but he was talking about a connection to the void, a raising of consciousness. The words were pulsing with the feeling of a seeker, someone trying to tell us that life is bitter and sweet, but that there is something else. When we first met, the term shaman wasn't in the cultural lexicon yet. Even though I hadn't heard of it, I had read about it in Jim's poems. He was well aware of the techniques of the spiritual leaders in so-called primitive tribes, how they would take psychedelic plants, get into a trance, and heal people. Jim had been a literary scholar for many years, soaking up books and poetry like a sponge. He had started writing at age 14 and had volumes and volumes of journals chock full of his writings, poems, rants, prose. Stories spilled out of his notebooks. In later interviews, he said that his life felt like a bow being pulled back for 22 years and then let go. Jim wasn't a musician per se. In fact, he couldn't play a single chord on any instrument. But as he once told me, when he heard an entire rock concert in his head and wanted to get all that sound out into the world, he thought of melodies to help him remember the lyrics, which were sheer poetry to me. What a gift. If you listen to Crystal Ship, for example, you'll hear the melody crossing some very sophisticated chord changes. Although Jim loved the blues, which have a simple 12-bar form, he also hung on to his inner melodies, which had more complex chord structures. Everything going on in his head was totally intuitive, and without the three of us musicians, he'd have had no form to attach to it. He could write the quintessential Roadhouse Blues and then the much more complicated When the Music's Over and still keep going. The music was never over for Jim. Someone remarked to me that if Jim hadn't found the band, he might have died sooner. I'm still chewing on that thought. The positive side of Jim's success is his impulse to have everything and have it now channeled his angst into creativity. The negative side of it, of course, would eventually surface as substance abuse. The late, great Tom Petty, the superb song craftsman, told me a theory of his when we were talking about Jim. Some artists, the very, very great ones, come along with the flame turned all the way up. And the flame is all the way up and you use a lot of fuel fast. And you've got to just get the heat that comes off it. Morrison was full of creativity that had to get out one way or another. The spirit in the bottle eventually doused that flame. But all of us were blessed with his creative spirit for 27 years, that he roamed the planet and gave us that gift of sound. And the sound that came out of Jim's mouth was so special. At first, nerves made his voice thin, but eventually, after about a year of rehearsals, it developed into a deep baritone. Then there was his scream. It sounded like someone being killed, a moan from the bowels of his soul. For a guy who had never sung before he met his bandmates, his voice was a huge gift. While his fellow rock singers began to have throat problems and some had to undergo surgery, Jim never seemed to hurt his pipes, even though he sometimes sounded like he had reached down into his throat and ripped it out to show the world. I guess he naturally sang from his diaphragm, which is the proper way taught by vocal coaches. his 3 musical sidekicks, and it took 3 of us to match the energy of this one person. We're lucky and talented enough to figure out the perfect sound bed for Jim to lie down in. When he first sang the end a cappella, it struck me as a goodbye love tune. But over time, as we played it in the clubs, the middle section stretched into a king-size bed for Jim to revel in. You could just feel the love and comfort he got from surrendering to the drone-like guitar, the sustained organ, and the trance groove of the song. My intuition told me to take off the snares, a typical rock sound, and play the dark and moody sound of the tom-toms instead. Jim felt safe enough, cozy in that sonic bed, to free up his subconscious mind and let out deep, dark poetic musings. He unearthed the primal, sexual, Oedipal underpinnings of all of our psyches. The blue bus is calling us. Driver, where you taking us? Meet me at the back of the blue bus. Doing the blue rock on a blue bus. Yeah. Even though I didn't understand some of Jim's lyrics, I didn't question them. I felt them, and they felt right. My friend Robert Bly, the American poet, once said to me that sometimes he'd write a line in one of his poems that he didn't quite understand, but felt needed to be there. Wrapped in a sheet of sound, Jim exposed the archetypical undercurrents threading us all together that we normally aren't aware of. But sometimes, Jim didn't seem to analyze his poetry and just let it rip. Ride the snake to the lake, the ancient lake. The snake he's long, 7 miles, he's old, and his skin is cold, baby. We all took a chance with Jim, meeting him at the back of the blue bus, doing a blue rock, and we are forever grateful. The sound coming from the back of that bus was deep. Primal fears, primal lusts, and everything in between. When I realized Jim was on a fast ascent, I pulled back as a friend, for self-protection. Granted, as soon as we leave the cradle, we're all headed to the grave, but I knew my own descent would be more gradual. I thought what we were doing might last a decade or so, but I had no idea our lead singer was tapping into a core of universal sound vibrations, sonic waves that would last for 50 years, that continue to resonate to this day. Winston Marsalis, who wrote Blood on the Fields, the first jazz composition to win the Pulitzer Prize, describes music as an invisible force. I'm proud and grateful to have been part of that sound with the Doors. Fueled by Jim's drive, we helped him get that concert out of his skull and into the universe. I know that Light My Fire was played on the Apollo 17 mission in 1972, and recently, our first album was put in the Library of Congress, so the Morrison message did get out. I'm sure Jim is very happy about that. End quote. As discussed at the beginning of this video, The Doors wasn't just Jim Morrison, but 4 musicians. Key among them was Ray Manzarek. The following is also from John Densmore's book, The Seekers, where John talks about Ray's importance to the band and their personal relationship through the hard times. Quote, Organ wizard Ray Manzarek. You see, Ray came with 2 musicians inside his one frame. Let's go back to the beginning. After meeting Ray at the Maharishi meditation class in 1965, I ventured down to his parents' Manhattan Beach house to attend a jam session. I drove up the alley where I heard rock and roll coming from the garage. Ray came out of the front house, walking down the narrow passageway between these beach cottages. He wore a blue long-sleeve dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up and the top unbuttoned halfway. His white pants were also rolled up to reveal flip-flops on his feet. In one of the buttonholes on his shirt, he had placed a daisy. Ray broke into the warmest smile as he directed me where to park. He certainly looked more relaxed than at the meditation class the previous night. That had been a follow-up meeting after we were all initiated, and Ray was complaining about not getting the instant bliss that was promised, he thought, by Jerry Jarvis, the instructor. I knew meditation wasn't going to have effects instantly, so I was willing to try it for a while and see how it went. In any case, Ray and I broke the ice when we started talking about our mutual love of jazz. I told him that I had seen all the greats of the manhole in Hollywood. Miles, Coltrane, Art Blakey, Cannonball Adderley, Bill Evans, and so on. Bill Evans? Ray exclaimed. He was jealous. His genius was in the touch, I waxed. Yeah, Ray agreed, adding, Miles got crap for having this mellow white guy in the band, but he knew how good he was. Yeah, man, Miles doesn't take crap from anybody. Do you know all blues? I prompted. Let's do it, Ray said enthusiastically. Now we would break the ice musically. The tune is in 3/4 time, a waltz tempo that is a good test of whether a musician can swing. Ray and I locked immediately. It felt good. A major component of jazz is improvisation, which forces you to stay in the moment because you never know what will be coming up. There's a lot of freedom and space available as you improvise around the chord changes. In jazz improv or in guitar rock solos, mere speed doesn't guarantee the most creative solo, thank goodness. It's a balance between sound and space, between lyricism and virtuosity. It's about breathing in and breathing out. Sometimes it's cool to show your stuff, demonstrating how fast you can play. But when it comes organically out of an entire solo, it's better. Kind of like being human. Sometimes we have to run, sometimes we get to chill. You can read about what happened after that jam session in all the other Doors books. The extremely important thing to know is that Ray was the first to see the magic in Jim Morrison. He even received flack from some of his fellow UCLA film students for hanging out with Jim. They thought Jim was too crazy. The first set of lyrics Ray gave me, I think intentionally, was for Break On Through to the Other Side. He had immediately resonated with Jim's connection to the world behind this world, or, to quote Michael Mead again, the world where this world came from, just as I did. Another extremely important musical moment happened a month later. We had been auditioning bass players and didn't seem to be getting anywhere. Ray said that he'd seen a Fender electric keyboard bass he wanted to try. I went with him to Glenn Waylich's Music City in Hollywood to check it out. After parking, we passed the display window of the musical instrument department, and there it was, sitting on top of a stand. It looked like a couple of octaves, 24 black and white keys with a silver chrome top. Let's go through the record department quickly, I said, because if we look at everything, we'll never get to the instrument department. Ray knew what I meant. Years before, I got stuck listening for hours in the record booths. What a great store. You could actually play something before you bought it. Started by Glenn Waylich's and songsmith Johnny Mercer, Music City was mecca for all Southern California music junkies. I drooled all over Coltrane's LPs in that booth, I said, as we passed the brown mahogany listening section and entered the musical instruments department. Ray asked if he could play the keyboard bass, and the rep plugged it into an amp. Ray began doing those repetitive lines he was experimenting with on our new songs. I'm thinking of playing this with my left hand and the organ with my right. It sounds like it has enough punch, I said. We didn't want the bass to sound so mushy, which would have been a trap without a separate bass player plucking a string. Remember, this was before the advent of synthesizers and computers, which eventually could duplicate almost any sound in the world. The keyboard bass was a few $100, significant money then, but we bought it. This was a pivotal moment in the formation of our sound. It forced Ray to play the keys more sparsely, with his right hand only, and it also made him simplify his left hand bass lines. So now in rehearsals, I concentrated on connecting with Ray's left hand. Bass players and drummers are like brothers, working in the basement cooking up the groove. If they don't lock together with the feel, the ensemble will suck. You can have a brilliant drummer and bass player and a lousy guitarist and the band will survive. But if the rhythm section, bass and drums, is lousy, it won't fly, no matter how brilliant the guitarist is. You see, for drummers, one beat is extremely long. The space between one beat and the next is extremely important, since the space implies the feel of the entire composition. If you play on the front of the beat, as in military music, Irish music, polkas, etc., the style I learned in high school, the feel is rather controlled. I used this style way back when I played bar mitzvahs. On the other hand, if you perform with the accent on the back of the beat, if you don't hit the next beat until the last second, the feel is very laid back as in the blues, R&B, ballads, etc. I certainly got this style down playing in bars for years. When the Doors got started, we covered the blues a lot until we had enough originals, so our foundation was first built on a laid-back feel. If you wait until the last millisecond to come in with the second beat, you're playing the blues, leaving as much room as possible for the sadness to enter. Then the originals, with Jim's percussive lyrics. Push the pulse forward a little. Thank goodness Ray and I were in the same arena when we wrote the music to those words. Simply put, if Ray and I had not felt the pulse for Jim's lyrics the same way, there would have been no Doors. I don't mean to be self-congratulatory here. What I do mean to stress is that the rhythm section is the foundation of any ensemble, whether it's a quartet or a 40-piece orchestra. And without a strong foundation, the structure will crumble. It eventually turned out that with Ray and me as that foundation, Robbie could build the walls for Jim to sit on top of as the roof, or up front as the lead singer. The walls were formidable because of Robbie's gifted songwriting skills. If there is mutual respect, the structure will have balance and be very solid, so I credit the pairing of Ray's left hand and my drumming as a blessing from the muse. Now, let's talk about Ray splitting his brain into two. He simultaneously had to lock into a repetitive bass pulse with his left hand and support Jim's lyrics playing chord changes with his right. To do this, he said he thought of playing boogie-woogie bass lines that he learned as a kid in Chicago. If that wasn't enough, he occasionally came up with the most memorable keyboard hooks, music segues in popular music. For example, think of the intro to Light My Fire. It's a circle of fifths played in a Baroque Bach-like style. This keyboard part is permanently stamped on everyone's brain. We will never forget it. Or, take what he created in Riders on the Storm, the mysterious sound supporting Jim's dark lyrics. It was an incredible extended piano solo that I wrote with him up and down the full arc of human emotions. From pianissimo to fortissimo and eventually everything in between. That solo of Ray's will also be stamped on all our brains forever. You only need to hear a couple of bars of music from a great artist and you can identify who it is. Elvin Jones, Ravi Shankar, Janis Joplin, Bob Marley, Van and Jim Morrison. You hear Ray's hand on a Vox organ and you know who it is in 3 seconds. Maybe it's sadness over losing Ray. My early father figure had crossed over. But these days, I aspire to having an even better relationship with my old keyboard player than before. I make a joke about this over and over concerning my deceased mother, but maybe it's not really a joke. An even bigger space can open up in the wake of a significant person's departure. My mind tends to go to my mother and to Ray more often now, because I know that I can't reach them on a physical level. For instance, having dinner in a French restaurant, I flip my fork over like Europeans do and immediately think of Ray. He and his wife Dorothy always ate that way, looking like sophisticated continental diners. As a 20-year-old, I was intimidated by their sophistication. I felt clumsy with my less refined manners. My self-esteem did get a lift, however, when we toured France. My simplified French served me well, while Ray and Dorothy retreated into silence. When I was young, I aspired to be like the extremely cultured ivory tinkler in our band, and I'm still working on it. Back then, Ray was exceptionally well-read, and now I'm catching up. He is still my teacher, now more than ever. I recently had some medical issues around my abdomen, burst appendix, the same area of the body that took Ray out. My compassion for him has increased twofold, now that my own experience has made me more aware of how he must have suffered. Okay, I'm sure some of you readers right now are thinking, it's sweet that John is talking to the dead Ray, but let's get real. There's no actual communication once people you knew break on through to the other side. All I can say is, it's more than just mental candy, this expectation that I'm going to jam again with Ray in that big band in the sky. Musicians are serious when they talk about all the incredible musicians now playing in God's orchestra. There's a very deep bond between melody makers. Check out Ray's solo record, Golden Scarab, to see clearly into his metaphysical side. Now I sound like my devout Catholic mother, who is going to see all her friends in heaven. It's a mystery to me, a great mystery, with a capital M. Maybe that's why Ray had a giant Art Deco poster with a big M in the middle. Of course the M stood for Manzarek, which implies he had a large ego. When I challenged Ray in my first memoir that he might be working the Willie Loman beat a little too hard, the selling of the Doors, he got back at me in his own book by saying that Jim had hated me as a human being. Jim might very well have said that, probably while tripping, and maybe because I didn't do as many drugs as he did. But you see, Jim and I are okay with that now. I sacrificed over 5 years of my life trying to preserve Jim's legacy through a brutal court battle. It's amusing, or rather prophetic, how in Riders, I used what I thought was just a technique to communicate with Jim, writing him a continuing letter in the first person as if he could hear me even though he had passed. Now, I feel the love energy not only with Jim, but with Ray too. Toward the end of our career, a philosophical gap grew between Ray and me. You can read all about it in The Doors Unhinged, but here it suffices to say that I was so angry at him, I felt it would take several incarnations to forgive him. Now, writing Unhinged helped. As I wrote the last chapter of that book, how could I not love Ray? We had created magic together in a garage so many years ago. I sent that last chapter to Ray and Robbie before the book was published, to make sure they got to that section, because the first half was going to be a tough pill for them to swallow. But even among those philosophical and personal struggles, the two of us never lost the almost telepathic communication we had on the musical level. He was comfortable, as I was, with venturing outside traditional rhythmic and chord structures, but he also knew that eventually you had to get back or you would leave the cosmos and your audience behind. When to come back is the question, and that is one that can only be answered intuitively. Ray and I were completely in sync when it came to finding common musical ground. The musical ground each of us brought to our partnership fed us well and fertilized our unique sound and feel. With my drums and Ray's left hand as the bottom, Robbie Krieger's liquid guitar completed the sound. The resulting melting pot was an American gumbo that Jim obviously couldn't get enough of. I say that not out of arrogance. Just think about it. Here was a guy who had never sung before and who, after getting over his shyness, sang from the bowels of his vocal cords. He was in heaven, lying on the bed of sound we made for him. Without Manzarek, our quartet would have sounded like a three-legged dog. When I heard that Ray was getting really sick, I gave him a call. Our relationship had obviously been strained, so I was very pleased that he picked up the phone. We talked about his bout with cancer, and I said to give his wife Dorothy my love. At the time, I didn't know it was going to be my last conversation with him. I'm so grateful that we had a closing talk. I will forever miss this remarkable, gifted musician. After Ray passed, I called Robbie, told him death trumps everything, suggested we get together. It felt so good. After only a few bars, we were back in the garage in Venice, California.